welcome to the inaugural Export Film Podcast. My name is Jack.
And my name is Ben.
And in this one, we're going to be talking about Mike Leigh's 1993 opus.
Definitely an opus.
Naked, starring David Thewlis, Leslie Sharp, and Catherine Cartledge, R.I.P. Before we start, we'll outlay what we're saying. A manifesto, I suppose.
Manifesto, yeah.
So the first, well, for as long as we want, really, it's going to be about films that shaped us. We've both grown up together, both watched the same films, thought the same thoughts.
Yeah, since we were right young.
And yeah, so a lot of these films to start off with are going to be, I don't want to say, well, I suppose they are nostalgic.
Now, nostalgic, but also foundational. I think if we're going to look at anything new, you need to understand where we're coming from. And we're very much wanting to address and readdress those foundations.
Yeah, we are. It's been quite interesting over, I'm sorry to say, because everyone's saying it in a minute, but over this period, both of us have been revisiting stuff that we thought we loved, or that we still do love.
Seeking a little bit of comfort in these uncertain times.
Yeah, that's for sure. So yeah, that's what we're going to be doing for these first ones anyway, and then it's going to branch off into wider discussions about
contemporary films as well. We're not just beholden to everything from the early 2000s, late 90s.
Yeah.
Very much looking contemporary, and also with a focus on world cinema as well. We want to make that very clear from the outset.
Yeah,
that,
we do.
English-speaking films are certainly not privileged here, although we are most familiar. Well, not most familiar, but we are very familiar with those films. They're certainly not privileged.
No, that's for sure. And like, I mean, a lot of these films that we're going to be talking about, we've experienced them in a sort of similar way, where there's late night TV, film for, early in the morning, watching stuff at like 14, 15, 16 and beyond. Experiencing it on your own, your mum and dad's house.
Everyone's asleep.
Volume down, because of some naughty bits in it. And yeah, kind of coming to be through these films, really, innit?
Absolutely. And to be honest, it couldn't start anywhere other than with Mike Leigh's Naked, because that has very much been an essential part of who we are to a certain extent.
I
would certainly say, and I think we would certainly not be alone in saying that.
No way.
There is certainly something about the sensibility of that film which appeals to the adolescents, and it has been interesting to return to it now as in our early to mid 20s, and to fall in love with it again, but in a very different way.
That's for sure. I mean, for a long time, Naked was one of those pieces, like, beyond you, when we'd seen it. If I was out, or I was at a house party or something like that, and I was sat down next to someone that I didn't know, much like the main character, David Thewlis' character, who just seems to just go off on a tangent that he's comfortable with, regardless of the context. I do much of the same, but it was kind of like sounding someone out, whether they'd seen Naked a lot of the time. It's like, oh yeah, but have you seen this? And then, promptly going off on one and kind of butchering quotes from the film, really. So yeah, and I like revisiting, and we're going to go into this obviously, but like revisiting now, there are a lot of elements that I really loved and that I didn't question, that now I still love, but do question.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a central topic.
So I suppose we should, without further ado, jump right in. I'll do a little brief intro to the film, and then I guess we'll kind of pick up from there.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, Naked, right. Mike Leigh, and until recently, has been a director who I think makes films of inquiry. He asks questions rather than seeking to be politically moralising. None of his films ask more questions than this one. Mike Leigh has a kind of uncertain place within the tradition of kitchen sink realism, and Naked is perhaps his most overt rejection of this convention, and it's a testament to his strength and vision as a filmmaker. Naked is Mike Leigh's 1993 opus, an absolute triumph in more ways than one. Described by Leigh himself as his peripatetic or walking picture, the film follows the wanderings and meanderings of Johnny, played masterfully and understandingly by David Thewlis. The film opens with Johnny having sex with a young woman down a Manchester back alley. The encounter seems to be consensual for a time before a threshold is crossed. The woman struggles, tries to push the man away, yet he continues. Fearing the repercussions of his actions, Johnny steals a car, which presumably belongs to the young woman, but can't say for certain, and drives down to London with the intention of hiding out at his ex-girlfriend Louise's house. When he arrives there, and Thewlis delivers his very first lines of the film, it becomes clear that things will not be so straightforward. Resolutely iconoclastic in all things, Thewlis's lines seem to issue from his lips as if they were being spat at his interlocutor, which is the perfect counterpart to Catherine Cartledge's, who plays Louise's flatmate's, tight jaw and almost slurred speech throughout. Before long, Johnny feels oppressed by his reunion with Leslie Sharp, who plays his ex-girlfriend Louise, and his burgeoning relationship with Cartledge's Sophie, deciding that it's better to sleep outdoors rather than in the house any longer. Johnny turns to the streets of London on a winter's night. From this point onwards, Naked takes the form of a picaresque tale in which Johnny walks from site to site, meeting a series of true characters along the way. These characters are heightened versions of people that we may know. They provide the extraordinary to the ordinary, or rather the ordinary to the extraordinary, depending on what you reckon. Each interaction is punctuated by Johnny's lightning intellect and mordant wit, with monologues that span from the truly brilliant to the totally absurd and delusional. Many of his listeners mistake him for charming, as it is this very intellect that endears him to them. Neither his interlocutors nor the audience are let off the hook from the constant oppressive flow of Thewlis's delivery, making it perfectly understandable when Johnny is once more to be turned around and thrust back out into the cold. With proficiency and aplomb, Johnny entangles himself in the lives of a series of troubled women, which he is able to disentangle himself from just as effortlessly. Nabokov once called the depiction of sex in Hollywood the copulation of clichés, and sex in this film could not be more antithetical to that. It is shocking and at times painful to endure as a viewer. Running in parallel to Johnny's frustrated sexual encounters are those of Jeremy, a certified caricature yuppie who seems to be a legitimate rapist. One can't help but feel that Leigh perhaps uses the Jeremy character as a way of steering Johnny away from being accused of rape and abuse, and instead of landing him more firmly in the characterization of just being a bit of a bastard. The art of this lies in Leigh's direction and the performances of his cast. Many of such are the best in their careers or yet to date. Leigh's world is one in which there is simply too much agitation to allow for any soft and gentle sexual consummation. Sex here is not the crescendo of a relationship between people, but is rather part of a certain dirge. Ironically, the most alienating parts of this film are the instances in which two bodies meet, or rather collide, in sexual union. And this spirit of agitation is carried through right to the end, in which Louise proposes that her and Johnny return to Manchester together. Johnny agrees and Louise goes to work to hand in her notice. Somewhat, I would say satisfyingly, Leigh subverts our expectations as Johnny, hobbling away, continues on his path of being a bit of a bastard. He hasn't reached the end of his journey yet. The choice of whether to return to Manchester may have seemed to many as the decision between salvation and perdition, but I believe that this is completely unfounded. By the end, we know everything and nothing about the character of Johnny, and perhaps we have no right to know. And of course, if that wasn't abundantly clear, now we'll make it very clear that this will be a spoiler-tastic discussion, as every discussion will be.
Oh, we'll be thorough. There'll be no divvies.
Make no apologies for a film that came out in 1993, which you have no excuse not to have seen yet.
Yep, this is true.
So I suppose we should jump in with exactly what it is that's changed since we saw it back when we were... I mean, we should probably talk about when we first saw it first.
Yeah. I mean, we alluded to it in the introduction, but my first encounter with this, as with like loads of seminal films growing up, was early morning Film 4 Extreme Cinema season. Mark Commode introducing it. Of course. Yeah, and I think I must have been. I mean, there was a bit of like just a period for both of us. It must have been about from 13 to, I mean, now I suppose just constantly getting into fringe stuff. And this was one. Or it must again 2 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock in the morning, something like that. Anyway.
Which I think is the optimal time to watch a film like this.
Yeah, definitely. One that's nocturnal in every sense.
It needs some of the anger that comes with sleep deprivation, and half of you wants to go to sleep and half of you just cannot.
Yeah.
And that sort of inner dichotomy, I think that's exactly what a film like this requires.
Yeah, it does.
My experience was, of course, very, very similar. I think I saw this film for the first time when I was maybe 15. I think you lent me it.
Yeah.
When we were
still at school. Took me ages to get the DVD, by the way.
Yeah. And it was one of those where, watched it late at night. Probably watched it, I think I actually watched it twice in a row, or at least I might have gone back and skipped to a few of my favourite bits.
Yeah.
Like we did when we were younger,
End is nigh, bro.
End is nigh. And it was one of those that was just sort of almost a breakwater for us. I don't think I would say it was an absolute breakwater, but it was one of those. But
one of many.
One of many. It was a series, like it was part of the waterfall.
Yeah,
let's say
that's a good one.
But it's something that we probably talked about, especially in terms of the writing and the dialogue. It's a film which we might have talked about more than any other, I would say. We spent a lot of time poring over the script and essentially trying to pick apart what we just experienced, because I think part of the power of Thewlis's performance and the writing in this film is the way in which it kind of befuddles you and tries to befuddle you.
Yeah.
And that's probably something that's changed in my rewatching recently. Yeah. The reason why I said initially that it works best at that sort of adolescent period in which you have those sort of acting out nihilistic tendencies.
Yeah, there's also like more room for admiration, I think, as well, because I remember just absolutely... besotted with not only the character but Thewlis himself.
There's something about being young and hearing all these esoteric nouns and archaic adjectives that you
illusions as well. Where you're just like fucking looking up everything that he says.
Yeah, and there's something about that. There's kind of room to dive into us. There's that space for you to properly get stuck in and involved.
Yeah.
And now rewatching it, that you're not catching up in the same sort of way. You do understand most of the references, and you kind of realise how silly some of the things that he says really are.
Yeah,
that certainly changed my viewing of it in a lot of ways. In this rewatch specifically, I definitely appreciated the dialogue, but I think I was less blinded by it.
Yeah.
Blinded by its brilliance, what I thought it was when we were
younger.
It
comes down to the performance as well. I mean, he delivers it with such eloquence. Like there aren't many where you're conscious of there not being a pause. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like when I was watching it, I was like, he knows what he's saying so well that he doesn't. There's no separation between the lines. You know what I mean? It's that's something that's still knocked me out.
Absolutely,
But the problem is when you kind of rewatch something like this after not seeing it for a good few years, is that the references, they don't get more mature.
No.
You kind of come back to the person that you was at that point. And that's one part of it that really kind of I was thinking about. I was like, I don't remember that being so obvious.
Yeah, there are some films which mature, and there are some films where you mature and they don't get any older.
Yeah.
And this is perhaps one of those.
I mean, for instance, I remember being really conscious of the sort of daddy mummy issues, the backstory, the unseen in his past. But there comes a point in the film, especially with the Brian sequence, where there's this where he calls him dad, and then he flips it and he goes, tell me about yourself, son, or something, doesn't it? And he just constantly flips in between, what's your name, son, and stuff like that. And you can register and you're going, they're actually, I mean, it's still, I would say, a subtle film in a lot of ways, but less so than I remember it, that's for sure. But I don't know, I mean, obviously we're really comfortable with this film by this point.
And I actually think that we might have mistaken it in a certain sense when we were younger, because in my mind this isn't a cerebral film, and it's not intended to be a cerebral film. I think that we can be blinded by, like I said, like by the brilliance in the way that a lot of the characters are in that film. They fall for it, and in a certain sense I certainly felt that when we watched this when we were younger, we fell for it in a certain way, because he isn't actually developing a single idea. Nothing is like necessarily unfolding in the way of this man has something to say.
No.
He just has some noise to make.
Yeah, he does.
And it's, as I say, I don't think Mike Leigh intended for this to be a cerebral picture. I think it's more of like a splenetic, acting out sort of explosivity sort of mood.
I mean, he definitely feels like an angsty teenager throughout. That's
Absolutely.
what got me. He is like a very scared, insecure boy that hasn't developed his arguments. He's got a lot of references, which again I think this ties in why it was such an important film for us at that time. He's got so many things. It's just like, I've read this, I've read this, and he goes off on one for ages. And then it's one of those things. The more you think about it, the kind of more insignificant the meditations become, innit?
One thing that I would say in line with that is Thewlis's body in that. He's so slight and so skinny.
Yeah.
In a way that we are.
Yeah.
he looks a lot like we do without a shirt on.
Definitely a hero wave.
And and there's something about that. When he's got his big coat on, he is this oppressive force. But of course, in this film, you see him completely naked, as the title suggests. And there is something about seeing him like that, which is a story in itself. I mean, I'm a real sucker for the way in which the body can tell a story.
Same, yeah.
And I mean, I don't have a whole lot of respect for actors who will just lose weight for the sake of it. But somebody who can read a script or develop a character and think my body must look like this, that's something which I think Thewlis definitely channeled there.
Definitely. I mean, that's another part that makes it so, like, the artifice of it makes it so convincing, because he definitely feels as though, that amazing thing where there is a through line with the character and with the actor themselves. I mean, you don't have to do much research to realise there were a lot of sort of methodology involved with this performance. And I suppose if you're going to play something like this, and especially when you've got the sort of directorial method that Leigh does, you're going to be sucked into it as well. But yeah, his body is a scary thing unto itself, because it's that weird thing. I mean, all the male characters in it are not physically imposing, are they really? It's more of a aura. It's this atmospheric quality that they all have. I mean, even the fucking yuppie in his Speedos.
He's not a threatening physical presence. Well, I mean, he is, but I mean, I know what you mean. His body is not.
Yeah.
And I kind of like the fact that the violence that's inflicted on Johnny's character is kind of like, it might as well be ghosts.
Yeah.
It's those boys
they're
at the end.
also kids, yeah.
That's what I mean, those kids at the end, like, obviously that's a cop-out, and like, the kids come and get him.
Yeah,
but like, in my mind, they were essentially just ghosts just coming to haunt him to a certain extent.
Yeah.
There is no, like, big male threat physically in this film. There's something else which is at play. It's much more repressive, emotive. Absolutely so I think so. One thing which I wanted to raise was this idea of realism, because Mike Leigh is often sort of pigeonholed as being this like kitchen sink realist, and I don't know how much I kind of agree with that idea. I can see where it's coming from, but I don't think he has an agenda. Well, I think he had an agenda in Peterloo in his most recent film, but I don't think that this, like I said, I think this is asking questions in a lot of ways, and I think there's a lot of things that he does in this film, which sort of state that claim. There's a sort of like a subversion of naturalism.
Oh, definitely. Even the more technical choices that's happening in the film sometimes, because like I don't recall in many other the films before Naked there being these scenes where, like, when Johnny's having the conversation with the woman who works in the cafe when he's waited for her, and you can hear the dialogue inside the cafe even though the camera's out of it, and like for me that was a bit of a interesting frisson that was going on, because you like you say, there is when people think of Mike Leigh, they think, oh, you know, it's grim or whatever, you know, these are all that sort of bullshit adjectives that people throw at his films, but like this is his most hyperbolic,
definitely
excessive piece. Even Mr. Turner, even when I think about Mr. Turner, in the context of Naked, it's just the viscera, I think, does come from that artifice as well, that acceptance of it anyway. For me,
I think that Mike Leigh understands class in a way that someone like Ken Loach doesn't, because
controversial.
I know. I think that the thing about Mike Leigh's characters is that they are of a certain class. You know, there is very much, Johnny is of the working class, and the Jeremy character is very much of the upper class.
Johnny character also wholeheartedly rejects the idea of work throughout as well, which is quite an interesting one.
Absolutely, and I think that something that Mike Leigh understands is that class isn't something you think about all the time. It's something which is a sensibility, but no one considers their class to be the most interesting thing about them, and I think that's something that Mike Leigh definitely understands. He's essentially creating people, and people come from different classes, but it's not about that class difference. It's like the way I would describe class, it's like you learn your class before you learn how to speak.
Yeah.
You know, because you're born into a specific house, a specific parental situation, a specific, you know, the food that you have access to. Your whole surroundings, your whole life, as soon as you're born, are dictated by your class. You understand that. And you kind of understand it to the extent that it almost doesn't need to be mentioned.
No.
It almost might be unconscious to a certain extent. And I think that's something that Mike Leigh really, really understands.
He definitely nails it in Naked as well.
Absolutely. I think that's his biggest triumph.
And even though, we were talking about before we started recording, but this idea that Mike Leigh doesn't want to be pigeonholed as a British director either. He kind of sees himself in the European tradition. And I think that's why, even though there is, even if he doesn't want it to be an explicit part of the film, that north-south divide, English white, is a very present theme in the film, whether you like it or not. But it couldn't have happened anywhere else but London. It's like it's such a genius setting. Even the characters that he encounters throughout the thing, that not very many of them are from London, really. Like when you think, the ones who he has, I would argue, the most meaningful and open conversations with, don't actually encounter with. I'll say that, even though fucking Brian. But like when you think about his interaction with Ewan Bremner's character, where you've got two people who don't really understand each other, and he's constantly playing on that throughout the thing. I mean, he's just taking the piss out of him. When I was watching, I was like, I wouldn't fucking do that. I want, you've got this, Maggot, you've got Ewan Bremner in like this thick Scottish accent, and like they're both talking to each other. But the more I thought about it, I was like, well, he does understand it, because he's completely, he's complicit in this idea that they're not going to understand each other, but they can still have a conversation. And there's and I think it does work on this sort of unconscious class level at that point, especially. You do get the idea that these two characters understand each other. David Thewlis knows him, and Ewan Bremner, he might not look like it, but he definitely understands this sort of vagrant period Johnny that's going on at that point. The
levels to it are so clever.
I mean, the only explicit class scene where it's like obviously making a statement is the bit with the chauffeur when he
And interestingly, I was reading about that scene, and that's something that they just knocked up in 15 minutes. Mike Leigh just one day just said, "Oh, should we get a Rolls Royce and see what we can do with it?" And then it just parked there, and Thewlis just walked into the car. He was kicked out, and he was like, "Scene."
Yeah.
And that was it. And I love that, like, off the cuff. You know, that was just developed, like, kind of pulled out of his arse, I would say.
Yeah, it definitely pulled out of his arse.
The way that Mike Leigh would probably describe it is that when you spend so much time making a film, you become a part of that space, and everything just becomes intuitive.
Yeah.
But we would probably call that pulling that out your arse.
I would say that, yeah. But it's like such a... I mean, the scene is really funny because the thing that makes the chauffeur realise it's not him, he says, he goes, "Oh, you got your missus coming in the car. Lady friend. And he goes, "Oh, she's not coming because she's got, sciaticus playing up."
Yeah.
And then he goes, "Get out the car." And it's just like, that's the moment where he decides that it's not the guy. It's just fucking, that's a very specific understanding right there.
That's another thing that I was going to bring up, actually. The fact that a lot of people talk about this as being about homelessness and vagrancy, but like, Johnny comes to London looking like he looks.
Yeah.
That overgrown moustache thing that he's got going on has been going on for a while.
Yeah.
And we're given the impression that that's just how he looks, how he dresses. He arrives dirty to London. And there's kind of this sense that, like, he could be someone who's just, this sort of upper middle class thing, of looking like shit, and like the idea that you can wear whatever you want, wherever you want, because you're of a certain class. There is this idea that, like, you can look homeless, but also could be mistaken for someone who is maybe trying to be trendy, or trying to make that over.
Well, when you actually look at his clothes as well, they're not unfashionable clothes. They're not something that screams any specific, but they look old. It's as though this has been his defining character.
Yeah. And
he's not willing to shake that. I mean, even his hair, his beard, his sort of facial hair is at a weird length as well.
It is, yeah.
I mean, there's that really funny bit where what's her name, across the window?
I just call it Woman in the Window.
Yeah, Woman in the Window. When he goes to see her, and she goes, "How long you been growing that?" And he just goes, "About 2 inches." He's just like, he's got these patterns nailed. It's already there. He's had this before, and he's always going to nail it. And it's because his character doesn't change. He hasn't changed for a very long time.
That's something I was going to say, actually. A lot of it feels like really rehearsed. That scene gave the impression that he's been asked that question about his overgrown moustache so many times that he's got it down to a T. And that's what it feels like. Like, you can mistake that for quick wit, but it doesn't feel like that. No. It feels like he's been cultivating this look for a very long time.
Yeah, that is another thing. My thought process, like rewatching it a couple of times before we did this, it felt less intellectual and more a product of age. I'd say, this is a man who spends his life going from A to B to C, and just doing, just experiencing people as much as possible, and as a result, I mean, throughout the film, is repeating phrases that he's heard before. It's like that bit where, in the midst of the Brian diatribe, where he goes, "Everything's peachy fucking creamy," and it's what Louis Sharp.
And as a tangent for that, there's obviously the scene where he's talking about Nostradamus to Sophie. And he's talking about, like, the invasion of Poland, was it?
No, that's...
he's talking about Hitler's invasion of Poland.
Yeah.
Was it Poland?
It's Himmler. That's me, that's it. Hitler, that's it.
And then he read it as Hitler. So obviously he uses Nostradamus as his, like, standing above her. And then when Brian brings up Nostradamus, he said, "I don't give a fuck about Nostradamus.
It's not about Nostradamus.
It's not about Nostradamus." And that kind of just cements the fact that this isn't a discussion, it's a battle for me. But you're right, it's like, he's got these things that he goes to, and if somebody else beats into it, he comes at it with, like, an unexpected level of vitriol, which is something that didn't exist in the conversation prior to him bringing up Nostradamus. And you can kind of see, it's like he's seen one of his cards, when he's playing a game of cards. He's like, I didn't even want that ace.
Yeah.
Can stick it up your arse, man. And I think that, not to get too philosophical about it, but the idea that, like,
you have to.
We're always sort of changing in life, and the reason why we always feel unqualified for things is kind of because we are. It's because we're always shifting from one thing to another thing. But if you can imagine a position in which you were static for 10 years or however long in one specific way of looking at the world, in one specific way of operating in the world, the same relationships, the same house, the same routine, you would become very, very competent at the parameters of that world.
Yeah.
And anyone who sort of tries to enter your world, you've got an answer for everything, which can be mistaken for intellect, but I don't think that it is in any way. I think it's very sad that he is so competent in this. I don't even know what we would call it. This
apocalypse discussions.
This stasis.
Yeah, it definitely
which is not human in any way.
And that kind of furthers that real opposition between his two friends. I thought you've got the idealist who believes in furthering knowledge, who believes in reading, who believes in like the understanding the self, the human, and then you've got the side of it that goes, but the end is nigh, bri. Like the game is up. And that's warring all the way through it. It doesn't, like you were saying, where he's having the conversation with Bride. There's just like there's contradictions depending on who he's speaking to. It could completely subvert what he's done before, and because he can. Yeah. Because he thinks that there's this inferiority because he can go off on one about. Make allusions to the Old Testament. Yeah, and he says he's read every book in the Bible, Brian, doesn't he? So, yeah, but it's really interesting, that conversation, because whenever Brian can actually have a conversation where he can take it further, which he can at every level. He's probably the most qualified interlocutor in the film. He is. Every time there's a thing where Brian goes, well, wait a sec, I actually know about that. Johnny will go, that's not the point, and he'll go off on about something else, and he'll be, the funny thing about that scene, even though Brian does have a preoccupation with his future, his imagined future. Johnny does at the same time. There's like we're all talking about this essence of what we need to do. And he hates Brian because he's got it nailed. He knows what he wants to do. Absolutely. He's got it down to a T. I want my little cottage in Ireland. Like that's what I'm going towards. And then Thewlis hates it. He hates that idea. I said Thewlis. Johnny hates it. Well, the two are kind of run into one another in a certain sense, especially because Thewlis has not, in my opinion, done anything since that film which has been of note or memorable. No, I mean, apart from the cameo in Big Lebowski. Where he does the same accent as well, doesn't he? Oh no, he does a Liverpudlian accent, that's what he does. Yeah. Lebowski. I won't do it, but... Yeah, and I think Coen Brothers cast him because they saw Naked as well. Yeah, probably. I mean, that launched so many careers, I think, Naked. Yeah. Although I can't. I mean, Catherine Cartledge, we should probably talk about for a minute. I mean, we didn't realise until we decided that we were going to do this episode that she's dead. She is dead. R.I.P. I just like. I mean, this could be potentially a future episode, but we might talk about Breaking the Waves at some point. Yeah. But she, she's an integral part of this film. It's just, I know that seems like a really bullshit statement to make, but she is. She really is. I think she's the sort of temporal reference for London at that time as well. When you think about it, I mean, she's the one that seems most in tune with. I mean, granted, you don't see it because it's such a claustrophobic film, but like, she seems the one that might know people, and there might be a bit more because there's this displacement with all the other characters. I always think, where does she go? There's lots of scenes where she disappears. She's walking back to the house, but we don't see where she's been. It's very clear she's on the dole, but she can't be collecting the gyro every time she nips out. Not doing gyro, no. Well, when I was watching the commentary to the film, they all prepare backstories because of Mike Leigh's method and all that kind of stuff. She said a really interesting one as well. When she decides to leave, when it gets all hysterical, kind of jumping a bit here, but when she gets hysterical towards the end and it gets all a bit melodramatic, she's holding an S, this giant S, and she envisaged for her character that she stole that from a skip from a cafe that had gone bust. So apparently there was the sign to it, and I just thought that's cool. Right? That's some good stuff. Yeah. And then she just kind of leaves around the corner. She said that she envisaged the character to go and sit on a bench and just kind of fall asleep in a bag, and that was as far. I mean, that looks like where she's going. Yeah, I mean, she can't go far. She's gonna be coming back. Honestly, yeah. Anyway, I also wanted to talk about like.
a lot of the effort that went into the way that the film looks aesthetically.
Yeah.
I think that's something which we definitely must touch on, because like symbolically and in terms of the set design, it feels very, very intentional in loads of ways. Yeah. Which I think is kind of running in tandem with this idea of realism, because it is a super constructed, a hyper constructed space. Like the scene that I think of is like the one where he stood outside the tube station and there's like no crowd control and everyone's just members of the public and nobody looks at him while he stood there smoking that cigarette. And in my view, they're not looking at him because it's London and people don't look at each other in London. I think that's because he's like, he doesn't look like a real, he is a character, and he very much.
I mean, he looks huge when he's going through.
He does. Space. It looks like he's stood on a step or something. I don't know if he's like a tall. I mean,
bloke, he must be tall, but
he towers.
He does,
and nobody looks at him. And I thought that was really interesting.
And that is real, though. That entire street scene is real, I believe. Anyway, that's from.
No, it is. Yeah. That was one of the scenes where. Mike Leigh's cinematographer,
Dick Pope,
that's what I was looking for.
Yeah, I was looking him up earlier.
He stood on the other side of the road with the camera hidden under a black bag, so nobody knows that they're filming.
Oh, wicked.
He's just stood there, and he might as well be just another bloke, just stood there smoking outside the tube station entrance. I can't remember which one.
Yeah, I don't know.
But yeah, all the naturalistic scenes they shot like that, where the camera was hidden, and it was very. The scene with Ewan Bremner is also shot in that way, from what I read.
Yeah, that quite an interesting. When I was looking into it, they were like there were a moment where they didn't get it because they had to break it up. They had a massive fight, didn't they?
Yeah.
In the middle of the street, and it got a bit too method for everyone. And Mike Leigh just went out of character. Yeah. Just like police were getting there and all sorts.
Well, we should tell the story where they did nearly get arrested.
Yeah, you probably have this in the background.
Yeah, so it was again they were doing an improvisation scene outside a church, I believe, and they were sat on the steps, and it's the same sort of thing. Where he was doing his Maggie, and then someone outside the window, I think it was early in the morning, someone opened the window and they said, shut up, shouting Maggie or something, and Ewan Brown just goes, fuck off, cunt. And she called the police on them, but they continued doing their back and forth, and the police came and they thought there was some sort of confrontation between Thewlis and Bremner, and then they tried to arrest them, and then Mike Leigh had to do a beeline running towards them, saying that he was filming it, and the police didn't believe him.
No.
And he had to say, look, my office is around the corner, and he had to take the officers to his office. To the officers to his office before they actually believed that he was actually making a film. Yeah, because the camera was not there. Yeah. So it's like, it could have just been like three absolute nutters in the street, and the police are just going, yeah. Right, you're making a film. You look like you're both right dirty.
Yeah. Well, there was a thing that I listened to with David Thewlis where he said that he liked the idea that he'd stay in character if he got arrested. He said that, I thought that'd be really good. I just thought I kind of want to see that for a minute, because you can see him, but you wouldn't really get anything more. But you can imagine him through the bars, just like spouting this stuff. And it's like, you like your job, do you? You like your job?
That's actually something which I think we should probably touch on here. Is Mike Leigh's approach to character acting, because I think it's a very, very unique approach, one which I haven't sort of heard before. Because Mike Leigh is big into sort of working with the actors. Which obviously comes from his theatre background, working with the actors to create a script. But he is a big believer that, an actor should embody a character, but not in this sort of Daniel Day-Lewis sense of only being that character. He thinks that's like psychotic and absurd.
I mean, imagine seeing that method applied to Naked. Imagine seeing Daniel Day-Lewis play the Thewlis character. You'd get something approaching fucking pantomime.
Yeah, I agree. And for Mike Leigh, I think that he has this approach of method, but it's more like a job, like a 9-to-5 method. Yeah. I would say, like, if you're on his clock, you're in character. When you're off the clock, you better not be in character. Yeah. And I think that's such a healthy and a very clever way of looking at it, because I think there should be an input from both the actor and the character. I think that they should be equal, definitely. Yeah. But this idea of embodying a character and that just being it, I don't think that it becomes a bit echo chambery. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean.
But it has that like that potential to create something really special, because you can have the times in which you are that character and the times when you're not. So the story, I've read that story where they came up with the 666 thing, the barcode, where Thewlis wanted to be. He was researching the Johnny character, and he read
everything.
He read all the books, and that's something that Leigh talks about. You're not going to be on my in front of my lens talking about a book you've not read. Yeah, something I very much agree with.
Well. Just as a side note, the masseuse character that you know the woman.
Yeah.
I can't remember her name now.
I can't.
No. Well, she's the masseuse and she's massaging Jeremy.
Yeah.
Where he says those.
Right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning, and that woman, the actor, she learned to be a masseuse for that part, and she hasn't got many acting parts since. So she's actually become a masseuse. Which is just
I love the vocational aspect of research.
I mean, that's amazing. I mean, I'd heard recently that there's a scene in Robert Eggers' film Lighthouse, which we both love,
of course,
where there's a really small scene where Willem Dafoe is knitting, and he learned to knit for it.
Right.
And I was just thinking, I just really admire that level of detail, because if it does all go to shit, she can be a masseuse. Yeah. Willem Dafoe can just make clothes.
And there's a high-risk manoeuvre as well, because it's very, very easy to cut a knitting scene from a horror film.
Yeah, it is.
Or a masseuse scene from a film like Naked. But yeah, so he was embodying this, the Johnny character, and he would just sort of go out. And he went, I think he was saying he was walking around Soho.
I think they did film a lot around there.
They did film a lot around Soho. I think it's like the most probably discernible location.
Yeah, I wish I knew my geography a bit better.
Of London, yeah.
I've been to Soho once.
And he's walking around Soho and he comes across one of those street preachers, essentially nutters, who are just shouting at people about the end of the world, sandwich board boys. And he hands out this flyer to Thewlis, which is the 666 is on the European barcodes. Right in the middle, the big thick line, they always go 666. Yeah. And he brings it to Mike Leigh, and Mike Leigh goes, that's genius. Yeah. And I love the fact that is, well, it's kind of the third act of the film in a certain way. It's kind of like what we're building up towards is that big silhouette style talk that he has with Brian.
Yeah, it gets all noir, doesn't it?
And I love the fact that, like I was saying, like the chauffeur scene is completely pulled out the arse. Well, I mean, that's not a very generous way of saying it, but you know what I mean.
Off the cuff.
Off the cuff, let's say. And the 666 thing is also part of that. And I think it's so admirable, his methodology, the fact that you can have confidence in creating a set of characters and then they will create these little... Well, not what the film's about, but like how the film is told in a certain way. Yeah. You know, like the form that the story takes. They don't create the story, but they create the form that it unfolds in.
Definitely. I mean, I can't envisage any of the performances in the film not being created as a result of that sort of environment. Because how are you supposed to develop that?
Yeah.
Unless this proves that film doesn't need endless resources, endless money. All it needs is a good mind at the centre of it and some actors who are willing to really delve into what it means to be a character.
And I think that's really important as well. We can't get too like fetishistic about auteurship. It's not Mike Leigh. It's about Mike Leigh being able to create this sort of cadre, this sort of group which are invested with the confidence to go in any direction they want to do. You know, like he always says, like, film is 100% a collaborative effort. And although we talk about directors, you know, as if it's saying their film, the beauty of a Mike Leigh film is that he completely vests his actors with like a sort of writing role in a certain sense. And I think that's great because it's so intuitive. When you become part of a person, when you inhibit a character, like, that's what he's trying to create. You think in that way and you can sort of, as I've been saying, intuit what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting that, like, the American reception of this film is that it has no plot. And I think that's a really...
Weird.
I mean, I don't get that at all. But I've read a few reviews where people say that this is a plotless film.
That's such a reductive reading of something.
Of course it is, yeah.
Jesus Christ. I don't understand. I mean,
a plotless film of sexual violence.
A plotless film of sexual violence. Put it on the poster. That's what I say. I think that is something that Mike Leigh's really good at. Is he brings into question what you want from. This sounds like a. But like, it does bring into question what you want as a viewer from a film. Do you want to understand these people as people? I mean, and I think this ties into something that we want to talk about. The temporality of the film, like the fact that this takes place in 3 days. 3 days. 3 days in the life of is a better synopsis rather than a plotless film about sexual violence. 3 days in the life of this character is not extraordinary.
No.
It might, it's full of violence. It's full of everything. The human condition is plastered here, but the human condition is plastered in 3 days. Like these are fundamental things, and I think the genius of the film, when you're thinking about it as a film in conventional structure or whatever, it is quite conventional in its structure. You have discernible acts.
Absolutely. As I was saying, the third act is very much the Brian climax.
The Brian climax, and then there is an end. The end to the character is the fact that there is no end to this character, because if there was an end, it wouldn't be Johnny.
Absolutely.
That's a stupid reading of it.
I agree, and having seen plotless films, this is very much not a plotless film.
No.
Not in any way. Like you say, it's a very, very traditional structure. And that is not a nuanced reading at all.
No.
At all.
Definitely of the I mean, you can go into this, but like, it ties into an age-old mythic tradition, if we're going to go that far, shall we?
Yeah, so I that is something that I did want to talk about.
Let's do it. Nice segue. There you go, professional.
So, in my reading, I encountered... actually, no, it wasn't in my reading. I was watching an interview with Will Self.
I've watched this, yeah.
He also pisses me off. No end. But, by the by...
I think it's his mouth.
Yeah, and he's just too tall.
Yeah, he is. Yeah.
On this topic, Mike Leigh was saying that... someone wrote a PhD thesis. I remember on this. I sort of an analysis of naked in line with the Homeric tradition.
Yeah.
And I remember him saying that he was reading these things and he had no idea what they were in reference to.
Fucking class. That's how you do it.
And I think that's very, very bold and very, very cool.
Yeah.
Because I think that the strength of this film is that what it does is it misdirects and misleads in a lot of ways. It kind of implies things but doesn't fulfill them, and I think that this epic idea is one of the things that is part of that. And I think that there's been a very, very conscious attempt in the creation of this film to create these symbols and things and these ideas which are fundamentally there not to be explored. They're there to be negated in a certain sense. That there are lots of obvious images in this film that we're sort of greeted with, which, we could say are part of trying to tear down this idea of kitchen sink realism in a certain sense, because, but the idea is that the fact that they're invisible to the characters except Johnny.
Yeah.
He's the one who points them out and nobody else sees them. And obviously when we were watching this when we were younger, it's like, these people don't understand the world that they're creating for themselves, the world that they surround themselves with. It's kind of part of his mission of saying that, you're all asleep and you can't see what's going on,
You
How
want
can
the human body explained to you.
Yeah, you're bored. You're bored with it. So, it's like as soon as he goes into the flat, he sees that skeleton.
Yes.
Skeleton
structure.
The
first, and then Sandra's flat.
And then the second time you see that is in the bathrooms, on the back of the bathroom door. There's a kind of like, a door effect. The opening and the closing of the door.
There you go.
There is the Buddha that he looks at in Sandra's room.
Body Dharma.
Yeah. Obviously, the kind of probably more overt one. When I'm saying overt because I probably noticed it when I was younger and remembered it was the map of Ireland in Woman Through the Windows.
Yep.
Flat. What's that stain on the wall?
Yeah.
I've never noticed that before.
Yeah. Damp patch, that's what it's
damp patch, that's it. What's that damp patch?
What's that damp patch on the wall? And she's just like, I've never seen that.
Yeah, but the most overt and obvious one for me, and kind of, I wouldn't say it was cringe, but no, that's probably not the right thing, but is the kind of kitschy shrine to ancient Rome and Greece that exists in Bean's woman's house.
Yeah. The alcoholic cafe worker.
Yeah, and I think that is well, it kind of culminates in his kind of magnetism towards the Odyssey.
Yeah, and also it feels like the most like constructed symbol at that point. Like it's felt sort of happenstance up to that point where you've had stuff. You know, he's either decided to talk about what he's talking about, or there's been something inexplicable that has set him off. Whereas at that point, it's like, oh, there's literally the Odyssey there, or there's literally someone's an opera freak and they're into the Greek tradition or whatever. So yeah, that was a point for me where I was kind of thinking it's sort of playing up to the character here, and this is where I would say that it's a bit too in love with him at that point. I think you have to be in love with this character, but I think it's a bit too. I'm just going to put that there, but I suppose this kind of ties into the whole artifice thing. That
I do have a tangent that I'll go off on that later. But yeah, I So yeah, he sort of picks up the Odyssey and says, you know all these stories.
It literally does a zoom.
I know, it literally cuts to him with his hands, with the book in his hands. It's a nice edition. I'd like to own that edition.
Yeah, it's good. It's well thumbed.
It is certainly well thumbed. A nice yellowed page.
Strong.
And, well, I guess what I would say to that is that the idea behind the epic tradition, well, not the epic tradition, behind an epic, let's say.
An epic.
Is the idea that a hero goes to lots of different locations. I mean, I'm talking about specifically about the Odyssey, and I'm talking about the Aeneid. I'm not talking about the Iliad.
Which he referenced, doesn't he?
The Odyssey.
He says Iliad.
He does talk
when
about
he's talking about homosexuality.
Yeah.
It was like, I'm not a homophobe. I've read the Iliad.
Yeah. Yeah. There is the yeah. There is the implication with Achilles and Patroclus, but the Odyssey and the Iliad are tales of a hero going to lots of different lands. But the thing is that the hero maintains a certain sensibility. There's always a constancy in these tales, because the way in which they unfold in terms of the epithets is it's a hero, son of this person, from this place with this specific trait, and that kind of encompasses the characterization of an epic. It's the idea that, well, they have a destiny, definitely, but they also have a sort of determined set of characteristics that they bring to locations and peoples that they've not met before. They have something. They have a certain baggage, which is admirable. And I think the reason in which Johnny is not an Odysseus is that he does bring with him a baggage, but that it is something which is always changing and morphing, and it's kind of the conversation that we were having before, the idea that it's essentially a negation of what he meets. He's not bringing a positive force, and I don't mean that as being like a good force, I mean like having a content. He's looking for someone to meet and looking to, in a sense, negate what they're trying to do. Obviously, Brian is a fantastic intellectual battle, but if we talk about the woman in the window, that's something which he essentially goes to negate. She offers herself, we presume, sexually, and he goes there specifically, to reject her in a certain performative sense.
And it's that interesting through line with the self-fulfilling prophecy thing that he's constantly articulating, this idea that we're predetermined to reach an end point. And every single encounter that he has, he understands where the end point lies, because he's going to set the precedent for where that conversation goes. I'm going to start it off and I'm going to end it.
Which is kind of the opposite of what epic is. Because the kind of working within the epic tradition is the idea that the gods control things, but you can influence the gods in certain ways. You have a destiny, but there are ways in which you can influence the course in certain way. You can win the favour of one god or another, and there's this idea of gods pick who they want to win, and the gods are kind of battling each other through the mortals. And there is this kind of uncertainty to everything, even though there is a predetermined, like, Troy is going to fall, Rome is going to be founded, Odysseus is going to return to Ithaca. These are things which have to happen, but there's the interplay between the gods which is manifested in the mortals, and there is an element of will, is what I'm trying to say. Every epic, although it looks like it's predetermined and it's determined in by the gods, it involves an element of will to it, and I just don't know how much of that is existent in the character of Johnny.
No, it's not.
It's someone who's looking to go out to negate and to tear down, as I said, iconoclastic.
Yeah.
With things that aren't even icons. No. Is probably how I would characterise it.
Well, he's speaking to people who he knows will not reciprocate the same understanding that he has. In order to
this monolithic condescension.
Yeah, it's just this. He wants to see a mirror, but when there's when there isn't a mirror there, or especially with a woman through the window scene, where it represents someone who is fundamental to his understanding of the world, i.e., his mother. Yeah, you're represented with something. It's scorn. You see someone, it's with scorn, and it's really interesting, like sort of perceptive. Sort of Mike Leigh doing a bit of filmmaking analysis as a whole, like through that circle window, looking through it, seeing someone who's not that person, which is something that this film inspired, which is an idea that this film inspires, like which ties in what we were saying earlier about when we were younger and watching this film and seeing someone who was, oh God, amazing, isn't it great? But when him and Bry are both watching her through the window, they're seeing someone young, youthful, you're a great mover, all that kind of stuff. When he goes there, he's confronted with the reality. Yeah. One of the few times where he sort of accepts defeat. Yeah. In the film, it's a major turning point, and she's doing, when she does these
ritualistic, really uncomfortable. After he rejects him, he does the classic,
this clawing of the hair that he does. That's a recurring sexually violent act that he just seems to be obsessed with. Obviously, the kind of symbolism of this hair and controlling it is like a controlled desire that is getting involved with. But when he's confronted with that truth, all of a sudden it becomes, and when he flips her over and he sees the skull and crossbone, and it sets him back. All of a sudden he's had this conversation about the end, about this idea of humanity completely getting wiped out, and when he's confronted with a really explicit symbol, something which is a really clear manifestation of what he's been talking about, he's set back. He can't deal with it. And he becomes a mummy's boy, and he says it explicitly.
And I suppose that's obviously a direct reference to Sophie's tattoo at the beginning of the film, which, if I'm not mistaken, it's a swallow?
Yeah, I think it is a swallow, yeah.
So obviously there's very clear symbology there.
Yeah, and Sebastian picks that up as well, doesn't he? Or Sebastian or...
Jeremy. So obviously
Did it hurt to have your tattoo?
I don't know if it is a swallow, but let's say for the sake of argument that it is. A swallow represents travelling, right? Yeah. A swallow is a bird who will fly away in the winter, and when it returns, it always comes back to the same nest. It's about travelling and coming home, isn't it? Cool. It's a sailor's tattoo. If you've done 5,000 nautical miles, you have one swallow. If you've done 10,000, you have two swallows. But it's the idea of going all around the world, and whatever you do, you come back home. Yeah. And then obviously that is juxtaposed with the skull and crossbones. And that's the one that he has the reaction to. Yeah. Because obviously he's from Manchester. He's on the run. He's not at home in London.
He says that explicitly as well.
He does say that,
Ewan Bremner's on the run. He goes,
I'm on the run too.
What does he say? Cops got you or something, doesn't he? And he goes,
Yeah. So, you would think that is kind of the symbol that would have more resonance for a character like that, who is destined to return to Manchester and has to return to Manchester at some point. But it's the skull and crossbones that does it. He touches the swallow tattoo with his fingers, but he headbutts the skull and crossbones and says, "What's that about? What's that story?" And I suppose that is kind of not what the world is saying, but that's what he wants the world to be saying. That's the conversation that he wants to be having that nobody wants to have with him, I suppose we would say.
Well, he's repulsed by her stasis. He's repulsed by this misunderstanding of her environment. And it ties into this, a wider thing about his mother, his mum and that. But he's repulsed by this woman because she represents everything that he's just left. This is Manchester. This woman, regardless of who she is, she's Manchester. She's something that that he's on the run from. And this sort of unwillingness to accept stuff and drowning herself in drink and not knowing that there's a map of Ireland on the wall. It's repulsive to him, and he can't stand it. He can't stand it, but he remains.
Sleeps there.
Yeah, he does.
And I think that's probably a good place to sort of segue into talking about mothers, because I know that she is kind of overtly the mother figure. But for me, in rewatching this, it was very much, because I can't remember her name, Beans Lady.
Yeah, she doesn't have a name.
Does she not?
No, she's just woman in cafe, I think, or something like that. I wish she did have a name, anyway.
Yeah, well, for me, she is the maternal figure, the actual maternal figure. If you think about it, it's the only time in which he washes, she feeds him,
gets new clothes,
sits by the fire, he has his books, gives him alcohol and looks after him in a certain way. It's kind of inexplicable. I don't really have the right words to articulate it, but it feels familiar with my own mum,
right,
in a lot of ways. And I don't think that's personal. I think that is like, she's not overly like affectionate, but like is wanting to provide all the things for him. And is constantly like, she offers him beans after he's just had beans.
Yeah, beans all the time.
And I think people, mistake her for being mad or something. And I think that's completely unfounded. No. I think it's the idea of wanting to look after someone and kind of forgetting the things you've already done to look after them.
Are you all right? You all right?
Yeah, it's exactly that.
Yeah.
It's,
Do you all right?
You all right? You sure you don't want to drink? Don't you want to take your coat off? You won't feel benefit.
Yeah. See, this is something that I think, like when I was watching it as a kid, I entirely. The first time I saw it, took this for granted completely. She when I was younger, she come across as distant, vacant, someone who was just another sort of.
She was mad when I was younger. She was mad. She
was mad, and she was just sort of another hitching post. She was that sort of person. But watching it now, she has such depth, and the performance with her is great. She like just the way she carries, the way that subtly she's got a drink problem.
Yeah.
Like, which is something that I didn't pick up the first time when I watched it, and it was just like she's and like when she's the way that she's bringing up subjects, the way she's bringing up topics, is so fluid and so real. And like when she brings up Christmas, and it becomes a conversation about suicide then. As far as I can say, it's like it just about the dogs, about childhood, about Christmas. It's just.
So I read that in a very, very different way. That's interesting that you took that away from that, because I took something a little bit different away from that.
Right.
For me, the moment in which she turns away from him is when he's rude about his mother. Obviously, there's the bit about the dogs where she's not very happy, but the bit where she asks if he's got a photo of his mum, and he says, look on the top shelf and you'll find one.
Yeah, that's something that we haven't really touched on enough.
It's not. But that's the moment in which the conversation properly crosses the threshold. That's the point of no return. And for me, that is like, she is the maternal figure, and that is the moment in which he's crossed a line there. You don't say that to your mum, even if she is a stand-in for
yeah, that's good reading,
And interestingly, that's the closest shot, as from what I remember, that's the closest shot we ever get of David Thewlis's face.
Yeah, I mean, you also have the bath scene before that as well, where we see Scar for the first time. His hair's covering it the entire time.
But during that crisis moment, it's cutting constantly to a closer and closer and closer shot of his face.
Ah, right, yeah.
And the intimacy of the camera there, it's sort of, you just see his eyes, his nose, and the top of his mouth, well, his moustache, essentially.
Yeah, 2 inch.
That's as intimate as that film gets. And for me, that was really the most important, in terms of his character, the most important turning point. And she's the one who throws him out, but it really feels like a betrayal. It's the point where he gets the most emotive about being thrown out.
And then he gets rejected.
Yeah.
And it's like, you don't do that to me.
Yeah.
But it does feel very maternal at that point. It does feel, it's just like, you don't fucking say that to me, get out. And then he replies, really childish, doesn't he? I hope your kids are born hunchback, hair-lipped,
blind,
bow-legged
and blind,
hair-lipped and all that. And it feels really the most, I mean, he is a reactionary character, don't get me wrong, but it feels like the most explicit giving up reactionary that you got at that point.
It's the feeling of like your mum would never throw you out, and then your mum does throw you out.
Yeah.
And it's like you don't even know where to go. You don't have any ground for an argument. You're just so angry, and you just throw the first thing out that comes to your head, the most hurtful thing you could think of to say.
Yeah,
and that's what it reminded me of.
Yeah, and he also says something really adolescent at that point as well, just to further that, where he goes, it don't matter how many books you read, you still don't fucking understand
people.
Yeah, people, and you just like you're watching it and you're going, you're not you're not getting it. Yeah, I mean that's a great reading, but I do think that is a mutual discussion. I think it's a further in this end times discussion that they're having beforehand. I mean, she's bringing stuff up there that is, it's simultaneously discussion with your mother, but also discussion with a sort of a composite familial fug. But yeah, that's great. I didn't think about the camera getting closer or anything like that.
I did. I rewatched it last night, and that was the point at which, because I rewatched it once, and then I, had a few notes, read a few things, and then I returned to it last night, and I noticed somehow I feel too close to him. I feel too close to his face in this moment, and then I was I finished the film and I skipped through it again, and I was like, I'm fairly certain that that's the closest we ever get as a close up to his face, because the film there's not a lot of close ups at all.
Even like the first. I mean, the sex scenes are always quite distant, aren't they? But like when he has sex with Sophie, and he's laying straight up in the bed with his hand on his heart, having problems. Even that, like if you were in a Hollywood film or whatever, you'd get a close up. You get the anguish, you get that sort of thing. But you've got this distance, and then just this silhouette, this naked ghost coming straight through. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. That's great.
And the most important scenes, if we are taking Act 3 as the turning point, then it's given in silhouette.
Yeah.
It's given as complete outline, and you can't see who's talking. And there's something to be said for detail, sparingly using this focusing detail on someone's face, and not just that. It can't just be indicative of emotion. It has to be something much, much deeper, which I think that Mike Leigh or Dick Pope have really, really got an eye for.
He understands it.
Yeah.
I think never giving in, and I think that's probably something that ties into that American reception, whatever you read, and it's like it's this lack of resolve, and like when you do get it, you don't actually get the resolve like you want. Like if you were to expect a close up or something like that, you'd expect some major event to occur, or some kind of like voiceover to come in or something like that.
Oh God.
Imagine that.
Yeah.
But you don't get that, and I think at the end, even with Louise Sharp, when she's with Sebastian or Jeremy in the kitchen, she goes, "Can you take your fly down?" And then she gets the knife out, but she could cut it off, but she don't, because that's not what's going to happen. This man is going to leave, and he's going to do exactly the same thing until he fucking dies. Maggot dick. So, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, to bring that back to the point which we started with, I don't think that this is an epic. I think it's indicative of the modern flaneur spirit.
There we go.
You see, it all comes back to alienation in a certain sense, because that is definitely a theme of the film. I don't think flaneurship is, but I think that alienation is something which Mike Leigh is intentionally looking to invoke.
Also, with the cinematography bent of it, with Dick Pope, I mean, you've got such a sense of claustrophobia. It's one of those films where all of a sudden, when they're out in the open air, it actually does feel like you're out in the open air. You like got all the, even the walls feel like they're brushed with. It looks like there's anguish on the walls. It's like this sort of charred thing that's going on all the time. These shadows and stuff, and it feels very deliberate.
Absolutely, and that's something which comes as part of the Bleach bypass.
The development,
that's a good one. That I wanted to talk about. So the way it's exactly what it sounds like. You don't use bleach when you process the film, when you develop the film.
Yeah,
and what that creates is a result which is it essentially imprints the black and white image on top of the colour image, if that makes any sense. It has the effect of like increasing the contrast between light and dark, but desaturating a lot of the colours. Yeah. So the colours are much more muted and much duller, but the contrast between light and dark is much more pronounced.
Yeah.
It's something which was used by Roger Deakins in 1984, probably most famously in British cinema.
Yeah,
It
Roger
creates
Deakins
that effect.
is done, isn't he?
Absolutely. So it means that like lighter colours can be mistaken for whites, like yellows. So there's that great scene. So when he's just been beaten up by the man who's putting the posters on the wall,
Kicks him in knackers.
and if you look at that scene of when he's kicking that bin after he's driven off, you've got the yellow lights above, but the actual tarmac, the concrete, it's green, and I think this is part of the bleach bypass processing. It's like it's not yellow light coming down. It's very much this dirty greenness.
Yeah.
And it also is the reason why the house itself looks like it's encapsulated in dirge and dirtiness. And it's also why all the daylight scenes look like the end of the day.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
yeah, it never feels like morning, even
never.
when it is morning.
So when he meets Brian, for example, after he's just finished his shift and they go to the cafe, like all the daytime scenes, they look like 4 p.m. on an October.
Yeah.
In October, do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
it looks like night's just around the corner, even though it's first thing in the morning, and that's because all the different light colours make it look seriously overcast, because all the lights sort of blend into one another with that desaturation effect. So I think that can't be understated.
No, it can't be understated. Even like with the few close-ups that you do get, the faces look like, you know, a mix, you know, as though they're just about all, as if each character's about to get jaundice. You know what I mean? It looks like they're about to go yellow.
Yeah, and I just to sort of bring that back to the intentionality of the symbology, that there's no colour red in Naked.
Yeah,
I challenge you to find red.
Yeah, that's a great
in
feature.
there. That is very much like an intentional move to. There's the great story Mike Leigh tells where they painted a red fire bell in Brian's building, painted it grey.
Really?
Because there was just this obsessive idea with exactly how the set should look and the colours that should be at play, because they are really, really fundamental in Naked.
Yeah, they are.
Like the colour palette is probably one of the, because as I say, we watched it when we were very young. It's probably one of the first films I watched where I sort of felt the aesthetic in a way that I've not really felt in films that weren't being like overly aesthetic.
Yeah,
you know. Like films that are sort of using colour palette in that way. That's probably one of the first films that really...
It's such a subtle choice, isn't it, as well, to decide, but like a really inspired choice, and it does add to this general feel of interiors. Like it feels even though I said earlier where you got this breath of fresh air when you go outside, at the same time, you don't really feel as though you're in the open air, but it does a really interesting thing to your head.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden you feel as though your eyes are just closing a little bit all the time.
And just to sort of give everyone their due diligence, it's Alison Chitty who was the set designer.
Oh, that's good.
And she was a theatre. She worked in the theatre.
That makes sense. See, I was thinking about this as well. I was thinking how easily, or not so easily, Naked could be translated to the stage.
And just to sort of finish Alison Chitty's story, which is part of that, is that she only ever did 3 films. And I can't remember if Naked was her last or a penultimate, but she got frustrated with how everyone wanted to change. You know, like the way that theatre works is like set design belongs to the set designer, direction belongs to the director, acting belongs to the actors. But with film, the director can sort of say something about the set design and it can really change the direction. She didn't like the lack of control that she had.
Interesting.
But I think it's really interesting that Mike Leigh, obviously coming from the theatre background, gave her complete control, and that was something which she couldn't find anywhere else, and sort of threw in the towel.
Go on, Mike Leigh.
Go on.
Yeah, you do get that sense even in the film. Yeah, I think even without knowing all this backstory, you do get a sense that everyone is acting individually, but together, if you get what I mean.
Yeah.
Like they're all contributing something very particular all of the time. And I think one thing I'd like to add, I know we've gone on a bit of a tangent here.
Let's have it.
But on the kind of mythic Greek element, is the music, which I don't think gets talked about enough. So it's harp led for starters, which is a really interesting facet, and I think almost comedic as well, and it is employed in that way. So you've got this amazing harp arpeggio sort of thing that goes on as soon when it hits the road going down to London. You've got the ding ding ding, and it's just like you're there. It's frenetic, but it's beautiful and it's divine. Harps, divinity, all that stuff. You know, you're straight there. And it's a really interesting choice for music, and I think it adds to this sort of elevated form that it's working in. This, like, you know, realism, if you want it to be, but at the same time this like elevated ridiculousness. Because as far as you go, I mean, when the lights go on, when him and Bri are like going through and they're doing the scanner and stuff like that, there's literally like a harp thing that comes in, and you just half expect cherubs to come in. I mean, it's amazing. It's such an inspired choice that you don't really see a lot of the time when you're watching. And I have nothing against this at all, but when you get in this sort of kitchen sink thing, a lot of the time it's diegetic. So you've got, like, you know, whatever's on the radio, which I really appreciate, and it works at the if that's what you're going for and stuff. But like this understanding that we're not dealing with that. We're not dealing with outside forces. This is something that happens internally all the way through, and that harp-led score really does add to this mythic without being mythic quality, this Greek without being Greek quality. Yeah, it's such a. I think it's Andrew Dickinson who did the music.
I think it is, yeah.
And I can't reel off the top of my head anything else that he's done, but like, if that's all he's done, what a way to do it, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and there's the great scene where before Johnny leaves the house and decides to commit to the streets, where, you know, there's that one shot where he's going in between the living room, the staircase, the kitchen, and that music's playing, isn't it? Is it cello?
I
mean, some string
bowed
instrument. I should know, but like,
and that's really intense. That's one which really builds up, isn't it?
It's such an inspired thing because you've got like a really sort of stylized Hitchcockian thing going on.
I think that's a good analogy, actually.
Yeah. So you've got this, like, the camera's fixed, but like everyone's moving all the time. Yeah. So you've got one room to the other, and it's really ridiculous. That's what I was thinking when I was watching it. I was like, this like following. It's like everyone's.
And obviously, it points it out. Do you ever feel like you're being followed?
Do you ever feel like you're being followed? And then it's just this really ridiculous exchange that's happening. Meanwhile, Leslie Sharp, Louise, is just trying to watch TV, and she's just like, fuck off. And she's like, he goes and turns it off, and I'm just like, you bastard. And he just won't let up. Yeah. Even though, you know, you've got Sophie, who won't leave him alone, but you've also got Theolis, who won't even let Louise be. It's just like let her. She don't give a shit. She knows what you're like. Yeah. Carry on, you know, with Sophie. Do whatever you want. And then he just like, he can't accept it. He's attracted to these wandering, insecure characters that are really interesting, like Sophie. But he kind of wants. He still does want Louise. Yeah. I mean, she is the life and soul of the film. We haven't.
She's the one that I'm in love with.
Yeah, we haven't spoke about this enough, but she gets better every time you watch it. Her performance is a very hard one to do because you've got a lot of hysterical performances. It's very over the top.
It's very subtle.
She just nails it. She's the one, and he's the one that he fundamentally respects the most.
And I would also say that she's like someone who lacks confidence. I think that's a very, very difficult thing to pull off as an actor without being overtly shy.
But she's so strong with it.
But that's what I mean. She's very bolshy, and she has a sort of flag in the sand moments. But it's very palpable, that lack of confidence as well, and I think that's a really, really interesting characterization for her.
Yeah, and I think that they're very different, but they're sort of two in the same. I mean, she in a way that Johnny can spout off these answers that
they have an affinity.
Yeah, they do have an affinity in the same way that he can. Like, imagine going out with him for a year. Imagine going out with Johnny for a year, right? Exactly. Imagine going out. I mean, you'd fucking kill him. But like, imagine going out for a year, and then just she's not surprised by anything he said, And it's that weird thing where he's met someone new and she's observing and she's enamoured because of it. Probably, I mean, I don't think she'll have been enamoured in the same way that Sophie is at all. But she's seen it. She knows how he works. She knows the sort of person it is. It's not surprising. It's like, oh, he's fucking talking about Nostradamus again, is it? It's not interesting. And I think it's one of the most humanist, relatable relationships when you actually think about it. I mean, when I think about me and Natalie, my girlfriend, and it's just like she's not surprised whatever I say. Whatever. I'm not like Johnny, obviously, but this is a really interesting, relatable, most kitchen sink element of the film. That exchange, and it's when it comes in at the end, you're being fooled a bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's like every relationship that you have has positive and negatives, but like when you have an intimate relationship like that, it has positive, negative, and ground.
Yeah, that's a good word.
And that's something that, like, no matter what happens, that ground, you don't lose the ground.
No.
The ground's always there.
The ground's there.
The ground is there.
Yeah, and without their relation, I mean, that's what the film is. This 3 days is what that film is.
Absolutely. It's, in a certain sense, she's kind of the protagonist, if we think about it logically. Like, it's the return of the repressed.
Yeah.
You thought you were free of this guy, and he just disappears out of the blue. It just so happens that we're following him as the eye, as the camera, but like, it's her story in a certain sense, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Like,
I mean, that's why it's come.
yeah,
None of this would happen if you didn't stay there.
exactly, yeah. And I think that is a good way of thinking about it.
I mean, again, just the nuance of a performance just is another level. But yeah, that is. I mean, he wouldn't have anywhere. I mean, he could leave. He'd leave otherwise.
But he wouldn't have gone to London.
No,
well, probably not. I wouldn't have done.
No, I wouldn't have done. And I was thinking about this in context of all the relationships that he has. Even though he leaves, like he's on the drift at the end. He will return to each of these characters at some point. You can see it. I mean, there's another film where he does exactly the same thing. And then the sequel is the one where people get really bored with him. The fact that it is one film is its strength. If you were to return to that character...
I couldn't.
No. I don't want to see Johnny I don't want to see Johnny in the age of fucking Corona. Imagine this. He is.
The end is really nigh, bro.
Yeah, the end is nigh. You know, we're all indoors. I can't go anywhere. I can't fucking drift. And it's just like you get locked up.
The Book of Jehovah.
Yeah. So that's an interesting one. His character is such a product of the time and place, even though it is transient. It's like he couldn't exist now. I mean, there's a whole thing where he's like, I mean, the fact that he seems quite idealistic and he wants this furthering of knowledge, even though he conceives of the end. It's like imagine him looking at an iPhone. This seems like really stupid, but like imagine Johnny now if he survives when technology was, you know, the computer age where it really infected him. Imagine him now.
Let's take another point of vulnerability in that conversation with Sophie at in the early scenes where I referenced where he talks about Nostradamus.
Yeah.
There is the moment where he says, he quotes something, where he says, resolve is never stronger.
I wrote this down. He quotes himself.
That's what I was about to say. Resolve is never stronger on the morning after the night when it was weaker.
Yeah.
Platitudinal.
It's bollocks.
It's rubbish. And the pride with which he says, I thought that. And I've met people like that.
Yeah.
I know that person who thinks they've had an original thought and thinks that that's what philosophy is, or that's what a claim is, or that's what you'll be remembered for. You know, you look at a book of aphorisms from anyone, and you know, you pick up little pithy bits and you go, oh, that's good. And you just think that you can just say something like that and that's that.
Yeah. I wrote it down as well. I add subtitles up. I just ad-libbed that, but yeah. I don't want to miss it. And I read it and I was just like, this is someone who doesn't understand humans when it gets down to it. He needs to compartmentalize something, and he can't do it. That's why the ramblings exist. Yeah. He can't do it. He can't distill it to an essence. Because if he did, he wouldn't have naught to talk about.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's such an amazing quote, that as well, because it's one that you kind of to bring it back, context-wise, when we saw it, it's just like when you kind of glaze over it, you just think, oh, well, that's probably good.
He says it so quickly as well.
He's ashamed. He realises it's bollocks. Because if anyone else said that back to him, he'd go, look, he'd like go off on one. He'd like talk about, he'd quote.
I would.
No
end.
You? Yeah, I would. I'd go, just repeat that to me, but repeat it at fucking 1.5 speed. It's just that is another point where you should question it straight away.
Yeah.
But saying that, I think we're going deep here. I'm like, I wouldn't want any other first experience of this film than we have had.
No, not at all. The fact that we can talk at length, as we have done, about this film is a testament to its content. The fact that there's so much life in it that can be dissected or vivisected, I guess, if it's alive. What a piece.
Yeah. It is. At the end as well, where he's speaking to Sandra when she comes back, she can't finish. This is something that I was going to talk about. See, like we hadn't talked explicitly about what we don't like about it, and there's not much, to be honest, other than what we've said before about maturation and getting understanding the character a bit more. But
we've only talked about it in the context of loving in a different way. We've not said what we explicitly don't like.
Exactly. I think this is probably where we should. So yeah, it feels quite strange when you get to Sandra's character, and it's not without merit. Don't get me wrong. So you've had rape, you've had violence, you've had intense discussions, you've had everything by this point. So you need a bit of a fucking relief. You need something that's going to kind of lift you for a minute. So here comes Sandra. Mm-hmm. After all this time, she's come back from Zimbabwe. She gets out of the cab and she comes in. And for me, watching it again, the two times that we watched it before we did this, I liked the character initially. Like, I thought it was funny. It was like, okay, yeah, she's doing a job. She's a comic foil.
Right. Yeah.
But after a while, I felt as though it run its course and it got a bit grating.
Okay.
So like the unfinishing sentences, and then when later on when Johnny Thewlis's character starts weighing in and finishing sentences for her, I was just kind of feeling, this feels like they've got to the end of the film and they're kind of getting a bit baggy with it, you know what I mean? And when I was watching it, I was like, I want her to stop being that character now and take authority. She's come back, it's her house. She has power over Sebastian, which is quite an interesting one because she's the most passive female that you've encountered so far, but he's obviously got something that stretches back beyond the film. And when I was watching it, I was like, all right, stop it now. We get the point. It's getting too far now.
And the last lines in the film are, how will the world ever ellipsis?
Yeah.
And then he says end.
Yeah.
Which is not my favourite.
I was disappointed.
Done him all.
No, done him all.
As they say.
Done him all.
What I would say in response to that is, I mean, Mike Leigh wanted Claire Skinner to play Sandra, but...
yeah, he did, didn't he? He wanted her to play a bigger part, didn't he, originally?
Did.
And she had, scheduling conflicts.
That's right. There was a scheduling conflict. She was in a sitcom with Lenny Henry.
Fucking hell, I bet she regrets that.
She agreed to come in at the end, and they sort of rewrote the Sandra part to be a sort of present but absence, and someone who comes in at the end and sort of is a sort of whirlwind in a certain way. And the way which they do that, I think it's very, very interesting, because Sandra's not a neurotic.
I think she's the opposite.
Although because I think I can understand a way in which you would say that is a sort of neurotic, not being able to finish your sentences, completely like being overwhelmed with the situation. But I think that her intervention is a very, very literary one. And I think the reason which her and Johnny meld so well, insofar as he can finish every sentence which she starts, is that they operate on a very, very similar literary plane in the way that they communicate. The things that she says And I suppose she has been a symbolic force which has existed throughout the film. Of course, she's provided the nurses clothing that Sophie is essentially raped in. She has the NHS towel which hangs behind Johnny in the scene in the bathroom. Yep. She has provided the skeletal structure, which obviously we've talked about before, the posters and the Buddha. She is a force that existed throughout the film entirely in her absence. And for her to appear at the end, it cannot be anything other than a literary intervention. And although I agree with you, it certainly does feel somewhat like ridiculous, the things that she says. It kind of runs counter to the realism. But like the argument that I've been making this whole time is that like symbology exists to unseat this realism and this naturalism, and that she is kind of like the culmination of these ignored symbols. She stands as like, she stands before him as someone who can't guide the plot. She can't guide the characters. She can't even finish a sentence. But she is standing strong as like a monument.
She's the boomerang, isn't she?
She's also the one with the boomerang, yeah.
She is the
she
boomerang.
Goes away and comes back.
She's literally the boomerang.
So I don't think it's quite like... I think it's interesting the fact that she looks like a cop-out because of a scheduling thing. But I do think that she has this literary focus, and as I said, she is the one who ushers in the ending, and she kind of gives Johnny the profound ending that he wants to the film in a certain sense. It is very like giving him what he wants.
Almost. I mean, there's that really weird... seeing if you were to watch it for the first time when she's in the bath, are you expecting him to go in? To do exactly the same thing. I mean,
I think I was the first time. Yeah,
he starts it, doesn't he? He's like, "You find me attractive." He does the same spiel as he's done before. You know, when he talks to Sophie about, you know, the effect that you have on the Mancunian member, and all that stuff. It's just exactly
full circle
in exactly the same place as well.
How much can one grow in 3 days? Are we really expecting a transformation?
I mean, no, if we were, we'd be dealing with Hollywood.
And that's why the ending works, in my opinion.
Oh, no, I'm not saying that it doesn't work. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that the performance at times I found a bit too hysterical for what it's trying to do. I understand the kind of literary element of that character, that that's what they are. But at the same time, to be elliptical the entire time, I think it's underwritten somewhat. I think she could have been... There's only so much she can give in that space of time, don't get me wrong. But like at the same time, I find it a little bit... I don't know, I wasn't completely satisfied.
Let's not get too bogged down in class, but let's have a quick detour into class discussion. So, obviously, we have 3 working class characters, which are Johnny, Sophie and Louise. And then we have the one who owns the flat, which is Sandra. And then the one who pretends that he owns the flat, or has a history, which is Jeremy /
the landlord.
Sebastian, i.e. the landlord.
What a great, the fact that you could put that in brackets next to his character, I think is amazing as well. When you see the script, if they did do that, I'm not sure whether they did, but...
So, she certainly speaks a different language.
Yeah, she does.
And he speaks a different language. And this is super anecdotal, and I don't have any basis for this claim, but I believe her character, very much having experienced similar people.
Right, okay.
I've met a few Sandras in my time.
She's the Karen of naked.
And maybe it's not a class thing. It's just the idea that like she doesn't have this fluency in their dialect. She doesn't really understand these people who rent from her.
Well, she says that explicitly, doesn't she?
Yeah,
I don't understand you women, how you live your lives.
Yeah. And there is something to be said of being completely overwhelmed in the way that she deals with it, which I found not necessarily endearing, but like I recognised it in a certain sense.
Yeah, I could recognise it. Don't get me wrong, but there was like just a point I was like, ugh. Okay.
It's overdone. I will agree that it is overdone.
I understand why she is the way that she is, and I appreciate that. I think that it's good up to a point. I mean, when she has a bath and she's blissed out, I'm like, okay, thank God.
Yeah. An aneurysm.
Yeah, jeez.
It probably would have worked better if she'd have done the ellipsis thing, at the beginning, been normal-ish, or maybe heightened, and then at the end, harkened back to that thing. I think that would have been a little bit more effective, because we would have understood that it started there and finished there without it like being every single step of the way. But I mean, she certainly pulls it off.
Yeah, she does. Yeah, she does.
And there's also the element that like his time in that house is definitely over.
Oh yeah,
which I think is kind of the ending. For me, it is. Her return is the ending. It's not his leaving the house. Like, when she comes back, it's like, he can no longer take advantage of these people.
And he tries. He tries again.
He does try, and he fails. That's right, yeah, he does try, and that's it.
Yeah.
That's curtains for our Johnny. And he goes out, and we don't know where he's going to go. But that's kind of the beauty of it.
Oh, it is,
As I say, like, we don't learn anything about him. No. He's one of those people who talks a lot, makes a lot of noise, but doesn't say anything. That's the idea of vapidity, I suppose. And that is the only ending for his character.
Yeah, he's got to go somewhere else and impress some other...
Or maybe fail and grow.
Well, I mean, he only fails, doesn't he? I don't think there is growth. I think perhaps...
But if we take this idea that all narratives, all films... are about the most interesting portion of a character's life, then I like the idea that the growth is the most uninteresting part of his development.
Fucking class. That's what we like in the first place.
It's all about the stasis.
Yes.
Because, as we were saying, if you've been stuck in this stasis for 10 years, then you're going to be so adept, so qualified in that sphere, that to develop will be it'd be like being a baby again, the most uninteresting development.
Yeah.
Like, you don't want a film about that, about someone emerging from that. It's about existing in the mire. It's about the dirge, man.
Yeah. One thing that I didn't mention earlier that I really want to, and it's about the scene with the big scene with Bri. And there is a bit that I didn't pick up on until this viewing that I nipped in before we started this. And it's before Bri lets him in.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's an exchange where his question is like, he's going to fucking kick me off. He's going to tell me to do one.
Put boot in.
And he comes back out and he's like, right, you know, when he goes back in, he starts reading, he's like, I'm going to let him back in. He comes out and he goes, it's fucking freezing out there. I was a cesarean. And I was thinking about this, I'd never thought about it before. And he was like, I'm a cesarean. Imagine like defining yourself as though it's a star sign. I'm someone who didn't want to leave, but I had to be cut out. You know what I mean? And I think that becomes... sort of, I wish I'd have made this point earlier, because it kind of becomes the fulcrum of this character. It's like, I didn't want to leave, but I'm here, and now I'm going to have to fucking move all the time.
Well, when he comes back to the flat and he's just had his head kicked in, he says, I'm still wet.
I'm still wet, yeah. It becomes this, like... he asks
why not me brother?
Yeah, why not me brother? But he also asks her, to bring it back to Sandra, when he's talking to her, he was like, what happens if I mean, it's really funny, but, like, what happens if you never get your umbilical cord cut? What happens? I mean, it'd be pretty embarrassing if I was here right now, wouldn't it? And again, this is the third act thing. There's this birth, rebirth, non sequitur that ends up happening.
A birth is a point of no return.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just like defining yourself as a cesarean. Like, that kind of blew my mind.
Very adept.
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, absolutely. I just love the fact that
I want a cesarean, by the way. I'll just say that.
You want a cesarean?
No, I wasn't.
Oh, you wasn't a cesarean. You weren't a cesarean. Nor was I.
Solidarity with cesareans out there, though. So.
I was born the way that Jesus intended it.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very interesting, though, that the essentially the climaxes in the film are the confrontation with Brian, the point where he gets beaten up at the end, and they are the points in which he brings up the questions of his birth. When he's most comfortable, he's talking about death, but on the point in which we could say he's on death's door. I mean, he's literally sat in a doorway when he meets Brian, and obviously he gets his head kicked in. It looks like he's going to die. He's always talking about his birth, and there's something about this negative aspect of Johnny, this idea of negation. And that's another point, actually, when the point where he's talking about the umbilical cord at the end with Sandra. Sophie has turned this big painting, not a painting, a picture, framed picture against the wall. And he says she's got a proclivity for negation. And I just thought, when I heard that, I thought that you are that you have the proclivity for negation. You're the only one.
She probably turned it round when he were there.
Probably, yeah. You are the only one who could articulate that as being a proclivity for negation, and that's precisely what you have because you can articulate it that way.
Yeah.
You are the negative.
It's a great scene when she comes back.
And that's what I'm saying, like, when he's confronted with death or fear or violence, it goes back to birth, and when he's confronted with comfort and warmth, it goes back to death. It's this idea of, as I say, iconoclasm and absolute negation whenever confronted with, trying to negate everything which presents itself, which is the epitome of the teenage experience.
Yeah, it is the teenage experience, and I think there is another film that happens where if the woman from the cafe, if she don't tell him to leave, there's a completely different film, because that's kind of, if she were to accept him and he was going to stay over, he was going to keep on the couch, it'd affect the man's worldview.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? But he would drift otherwise. But there'd be, this wouldn't be a 3-day narrative. It'd be longer than that. That's the sort of maternal thing that could have happened at that point. But it doesn't, and that's the point.
That's something I probably should have said when I said that it's like the most important point in a person's life. It's not just the fact that it's that moment. It's like every single event itself is the most important. There's a reason why we're not looking at like the time where he might contemplate suicide or he confronts his mother's death or something. Like this is not just like the most important point. It's like the most important confluence of all these events which run in tandem, and that's very much what I would agree with. So we've talked about what we don't like, but I think we should probably transition into what I would say what they don't like, which is the critical reception of Naked. Which
if you've come this far, by the way, I appreciate you sticking with us, because we're tackling perhaps the biggest, most controversial issue in the film now. And we've had a love-in, but we're gonna do it now.
I mean, we want you to settle in. We want you to be comfortable in that chair over there, and like, if you've got this far, then you're clearly not dedicated to the discussion of Mike Leigh and Naked. So, the reception of Naked was probably, I would say, a very, very interesting one, because I brought up earlier that the reception in America was that it was essentially a plotless and kind of like holding it up as this avant-garde piece, this admirable sort of like, it's kind of like the French New Wave in a certain way. It doesn't have a plot, which obviously is absurd. But that was sort of like, for the most part, I mean, not entirely, but for the most part, was sort of an American reception of it. But something which I read in one of the articles that I read was that the British press were the only ones who labelled this film as being misogynistic and essentially violent against women. It was the Americans who didn't have that reading. It was this sort of what Mike Leigh described as like being this old school left approach, this liberatory for women approach, which is so encased in this idea that the only way you can make a film which is liberatory towards women is to depict the liberation of women, which I think is fundamentally absurd, and I think that you would agree with.
Of course.
And obviously, that's the subtlety of it, and I think it's ironic that the Americans managed to notice the subtlety before the British press.
Very funny. I mean, there is a sort of foreign film element in that as well, and it's like, this is ties into something that we sort of touched on earlier, but this like Mike Leigh viewing himself as a European filmmaker, and I think Naked does scream of a European film, even though it's very British. It's dealing with I mean, not only dialect and all the rest of it, but it was fundamentally a very British film, even though there's this sort of European veneer to it, which does sort of make sense why it would resonate with audiences beyond the British Isles, perhaps.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose that the what Mike Leigh does to justify this is that in order to portray someone who could be reduced to being like, I don't agree with this, but the reductive idea of a doormat female character, someone who can be walked on and be abused, which is something which people have reduced the Sophie character, Catherine Cartledge's character to, and I don't agree with that. But I would make the point that in order to have that on your screen, you need to have an actress who is willing to do that. And you can't convince a naive actress to portray something like that. In order to create that condition, you need to have the strongest, the most, let's just say it, the most feminist actress. In order to create those conditions, you need to have someone who is confident in that way to put herself out there. And I think that's kind of what we were getting at earlier, and we were saying that like the central focus of this is Catherine Cartledge. She's the one in the film, like Sophie is the one in the film, who is like portrayed as being the weakest and being the doormat and the one who is able to be abused by both Johnny and Jeremy / Sebastian / the landlord. But as an actress, she is the fulcrum upon which everything operates. And I began when I was talking about it, I portrayed her as being the counterpoint to Johnny insofar as he is spitting everything. She has the closed jaw, this slurred speech. But I think that she's more than just a counterpoint. I would say that Jeremy is perhaps a counterpoint to the sexual violence of Johnny, but I would say that her role, I think it's more fundamental and essential to the film itself.
Well, there's a sort of parallel narrative with them both, isn't there? That happens. It sort of culminates when they're having when Sophie and Leslie Sharp, what's the character called?
Louise.
When Louise and Sophie are having the conversation at the pub and they're both sharing a pint, and then it's one of the few instances where you get a backstory.
Yes.
In any of the characters, or an explicit backstory anyway.
Yes.
And Sophie's talking about abortions, having kids and stuff, and you get a sort of you get a really rich history just from that exchange, and you get someone who has basically an understanding of the world.
Yeah.
Beyond even Louise's character, sorry. And it is fundamental because she, even though she seems quite taken and she is enamoured with Johnny's character. She is. She
undeniably so.
She loves him in a way that kind of transcends anything else.
Because she knows him.
Because she understands this character. She's been with someone like him before. And that's not a slant against the character. This is
that's not something she learned in books.
No, it's not something that she learned in books. This is
because he's just as vulnerable as every other man.
Exactly.
Is.
I mean, and it seems quite. I mean, I don't think you can be crass when you're talking about this film, but like when the first sex scene that they have, she's on top, which is a really interesting. I mean, it's a complete subversion of what you've seen when you first see the film. Is this violent pseudo consensual exchange? I mean, it starts.
Let's just call it rape. I mean, I know it's contentious, but just for the sake of argument, let's say that we've gone from someone raping to being underneath.
Yeah, we have.
Someone else.
We have. I mean, I think they both understand each other. They're kind of two and the same. I mean, it's such a. I mean, not only is it a very deep and only a character that a strong female actress could play.
Absolutely.
But it takes serious sensitivity, and it takes I don't know.
it's. I think that what we're probably getting at is this affinity which exists between not just both characters, but both like the chemistry between both actors. I think it's really interesting, that scene where they're walking through London and she's bouncing all over the shop because she's buzzing.
Yeah, she is.
And he's saying, just calm down, stop moving like that. But really, like, he is just as agitational, just as agit.
I mean,
throughout.
Yeah, this is
but just in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it's exemplified in the sex scenes as well.
Yeah.
I mean, like when he has, they have this quite romantic exchange initially, and then it transforms into this sort of power play. That's what Johnny does. It turns into this power play. You understand? There's this. It doesn't take very much for him to be comfortable with someone at all. I mean, it can be brazen, it can be really on the nose, and it can completely rule the conversation. But like, there's a different sort of exchange, and to return to that, and then when he, I mean, it's a recurring image, but when he grabs her hair, she's like. I mean, it's a really uncomfortable scene, and there is a rape that occurs. There's sexual violence.
There is violence, yeah.
There's sexual violence, but there's this. There's something quite deeper going on in that scene, and I'm not excusing at all the violent nature of it.
No, of course not.
But yeah, there is a serious emotional nuance that's going through both of those characters at the same time.
And an affinity.
There is. I mean, we've said it before. There is a complete affinity. That I don't think is misogynist.
So what I would say to that is that Johnny's got all these lines, all these things that he's read, all these ridiculous things that he comes out with, but there is no real takeaway from the things that he says. I off the top of my head, we've got a few things which we throw around, a few lines, but in terms of an idea, there's not something which is eternal and which has lasted. But Catherine Cartledge has a line where, in the pub scene that you were referencing, where she says...
one of the greatest scenes in the film.
The best scene in the film?
Perhaps the best. The most human. Won't say that much, maybe.
I think it's probably the best scene in the film.
Yeah. Let's go for it. Best scene in the film. Best scene in the film.
And she's talking about a relationship with men, and she says, what they start out loving you for, they end up hating you for.
And this happens in one day? Less than a day? That exchange?
But, like, to label her as being this, like, foolish, naive doormat, like, the experiences in my life... That's kind of how relationships go. I wish it wasn't how they went, but that is how a lot of relationships end up. Someone stands out because they're charismatic, and then they talk too much and not about things that you want to talk about. Yeah. They become, good with people, but then they're good with the wrong people, and they're not good with you anymore. They start out intelligent, but then like they're more intelligent than you are, or they start out, less intelligent than you, but then they're too stupid to have a conversation with. I think that's kind of the not eternal truth, but she is tapped into something which is more eternal and real.
Well, her looping narrative, someone who has had a series of unsuccessful relationships that have either ended in trauma or disappointment or whatever, is it runs parallel with Johnny's narrative. And this is someone who's had a series of failed...
She deals with it in a more mature way, I would say.
She does. I mean, she seems someone who... I mean, if Johnny was to walk in the room right now, while we're doing this, we'd be... I mean, you... Obviously, if someone just walks in the room anyway, you'd be fucking focused on him. But, like, he's dealing... and it does come back to this adolescent frame of mind, and his disposition does tap into something that is naive and addictive, and especially if you're dealing in an environment that is volatile, or there's dope or drink involved. That does happen through the film. You're kind of subject to that sort of mentality, but she's seen it before. She understands what's going on. It's just like and I think this might lay into the kind of tie into the to the criticisms. I think there is a point where Sophie Catherine Catledge's character plays it a bit too melodramatic at the end. That's what I was thinking when she's crying over the sofa and she's going off on one. There is a sense of hysterics that I don't think it's
you mean where she's hitting him?
Yeah. I don't think it's at odds with the character at all. I think he's deserving of that outcry. But there is something quite strange in the performance, and even in Thewlis's performance, the way that he reacts as well. I was thinking about this, where it seems as though that final scene is almost gunning for some kind of hysterical close. That it does subvert the end, of course, which is really important. But like there is something about the performances when it happens that where there is a bit. I think it just goes a bit too far up to that point. I'm not saying it's not justified, just the way that it's played out. I think it just seems a bit too histrionic. It's just my opinion. That's the only time where I kind of think that character falls apart a little bit, and it does become a bit too vulnerable in that way. I don't know whether you agree.
I suppose that's where the kitchen sink elements seep a bit too far into what I've interpreted this as being like a rejection of that school. Yeah. That melodrama, that heightened reaction.
You even have Sandra and Sophie like swapping places throughout that scene. She's like coming in, she's delivering her half delivered lines and stuff, and it just like I was like, this feels a bit, after all the wait,
it's surprising,
fluffy, doesn't it?
It comes out of, it feels like it comes out of nowhere.
But as we were saying, I mean, there is a function of it, narrative-wise.
I was going to say, which I think works very well for, you start in the home for the most part. You go out into the world, you get beaten up, and you return to the home, and then, you're not exempt from everything which takes place in the home just because you've had your head kicked in. Like you return to that in all its warts and all, right? Yeah. So it's all about immersion. It's like when you go home, isn't it? Like when you moved out and you go back to your house and you remember certain things about being with your parents, and then like it's like you get it all, the bits that you don't remember, the bits that you do remember flow into one, and then you're just like overwhelmed with this experience of being back in that space.
Yeah, it does become a hyper real thing. Yeah, do you think we've explored that enough?
I think we have. Yeah, I mean,
what we will say. Anyone listening, please throw us questions.
Absolutely. I mean,
we are well up for a discussion. We can't cover it. I mean, we were talking about before. I mean, there's stuff that we can't cover that we really want to talk about. But we want this to be as fluid as a discussion as possible.
Like water.
Fucking.
We exist without challenge at the moment, and that is unacceptable.
Yep.
So I think that what we should sort of wrap up this discussion with, and we will wrap up very, very soon, I think we should talk about what the impact of Naked is and what the impact of Mike Leigh's work is on the cinematic landscape, and what that looks like in British filmmaking and also on filmmaking in general.
It's a big one.
It is indeed a big one. So I was wondering what you would sort of...
I mean, influence-wise, if we're talking about British filmmaking, I mean, you can see the through lines in a lot of sort of cutting-edge film. I mean, one that we both absolutely love is Ben Wheatley.
Absolutely.
I mean, Sightseers is quite an interesting correlation with Nuts of May, Mike Leigh's previous film. It kind of takes the plot facsimile, kind of takes it to more absurd levels. But I think Ben Wheatley marries what Naked is trying to do with this film in a contemporary way. So you have the kitchen sink element, as we were talking about, but you also have this elevated, heightened, contrived filmmaking aspect of it, which we love. And I think that's evident from Kill List to, as I said, Sightseers, but even his most latest work, one that we saw I think it come out this year, didn't it? 2020. Maybe the year before. Well, that's when we saw it. We saw it this year anyway. So Happy New Year, Colin Burstead, which is sort of traditional.
I imagine it came out New Year last year.
I mean,
2019.
it makes sense, wouldn't it? Yeah, like a familial drama where all the people that you don't want to turn up, and then it just becomes this sort of hotbed of hostility. It's more Mike Leigh early.
2018.
So we didn't see. I think it just came on iPlayer and like a couple of months ago. So that's when we saw it. And I think that's the. I mean, Sightseer's that one, and like I say, Kill List kind of takes that fractured family thing, and like, you know, a lot of flawed male characters that are dealing with stuff, and then kind of transforming it. And we could probably do a full episode on Kill List, really.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said that I'm not going to go too far into it.
We won't go too
I'm
far.
conscious of the time.
Yeah, we have gone on for a very long time.
Kill List is another field which needs to be harvested.
Yeah, a very unsung British film.
Yeah,
for
like
sure.
Ben Wheatley is very much black soil, so to speak.
Yeah. So yeah, we've seen it in that, and then obviously you've got Shane Meadows, who kind of
course, who Mike Leigh admires, and who Shane Meadows admires Mike Leigh. Of course,
makes sense. I mean, and then you've also got sort of kindred spirits at the same time. So you have got Alan Clark. I mean, we should probably do one on Scum, really, shouldn't we?
I mean,
that'd be an interesting idea.
Yeah, definitely.
We're digressing here, but I think Ben has a few allusions in the American vein that could be drawn.
Yeah, and I think that I struggle to think about Shane Meadows without Mike Leigh in a lot of ways, because although Shane goes for a more overtly dramatic, I wouldn't say melodramatic, I would say overtly dramatic.
Oh yeah, I mean,
in the traditional sense.
The choral vocals do me every time on the soundtrack.
There is something about his working with characters. Obviously, like, Shane Meadows is held up as being, you know, this director who can work with children, and I don't think that he's necessarily like this, like, children whisperer, you know, in the least weird way possible. I don't think it's the fact that he can work with children. I think that he has something which Mike Leigh also has, and he's sort of taken from that, is the idea that we were talking about earlier, the fact that you want your actors to inhabit your characters, but you want them to be actors as well. And there's something which is to be said of, like, there is more to be derived from that. Like, how would you react to that, saying that you're embodying a certain character? How would you react to that, saying as you are not that character? It's that kind of duality of character creation and writing, which allows for this illusion of improvisation. I know that Shane Meadows does more improvisation than Mike Leigh does.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't spoke about that probably enough, but for all the Mike Leigh, everything's improv. I think the only improvised scene in Naked is when with the poster man, because he actually kicked him in the knackers,
right,
and he went down, and I think that's the only, because they developed.
Yeah,
they developed the script in improvisation, which is what.
So to sort of explain that, Mike Leigh's process is to, as we were saying, take the actors, turn them into characters in a certain sense, work with them for many months, and then work on a script from that. But to write that script, you know, it's very clear that when they're on set, they are actors. They're not those people, and they're not embodying those people in anything other than as actors. And to write a script in that mode, but not to have the improvisational element exist before cameras are introduced, before film is brought into the situation. You know, like, essentially improvisation takes place when no one is looking, and I kind of like that idea.
Yeah.
And I also like the idea of having a broad idea of where we're going, but not a specific plan, and working, as you say, collaboratively with people. And I do think that collaboration and improvisation should take place in the pre-production phase. Definitely, very much so. So that is something which Shane Meadows has taken on board, but, you know, obviously there is a little bit more improvisation on set with Shane Meadows than there is with Mike Leigh, but that method and the tradition in British filmmaking specifically.
We could go on about other stuff.
Yeah,
we're kind of gonna zone in on this.
Not go on too much of a tangent, but I can't foresee how that would have been possible without not only the method but also like the body of films which Mike Leigh has produced, of which Naked is, in my opinion, his best film.
No, it definitely is.
Absolutely.
We're both in cahoots in that. Again, if you disagree, please fire away.
So this kind of leads us very, very naturally into the topic of, we're very conscious of the fact that we're talking about a film that was made in 1993 and we sit here in 2020, many, many years after the fact. Different world, we weren't even born, but I don't think that means we can't experience the film in the way in which it was intended to be. But the question which we are left with is the Mike Leigh of today, and as we've said, we believe that Naked is, for the most part, his best effort at being a statement piece, at being a proper, essentially an auteurship in a certain way.
Because it definitely is.
He's made other great films. I don't want to sort of say that, you know, this is like his proper only good film. He's made loads of fantastic films, but this is the film which sort of stands as like his name is attached to this film in the way that David Thewlis is.
His fingerprints are on it.
His fingerprint. That's a better way of saying it.
Yeah, his fingerprints are on it in a way that I mean, again, it seems silly to say that his fingerprints are on other films, but
not in this way.
Not in this way, and I think not in this way for us. That's what we're going to make explicit.
Yeah.
So not in
not
in this way for us.
Our fingerprints are on it.
Our fingerprints are on it as much as
the
Mike
three
Leigh's.
of us.
Yeah. Which is the reason why we made this in the first place.
Of course. So, what we kind of wanted to leave off with a discussion of is what Mike Leigh looks like today, and what would it look like if Mike Leigh were to look at some of the films and the direction that he's gone in now. Obviously, his most recent films are Peterloo in 2018 and Mr. Turner in 2014. And these are two very, very interesting films in the Mike Leigh canon specifically. I've seen Peterloo and Jack has seen Mr. Turner. So, you know, there's your reference. And I guess you should start chronologically. So,
I mean, like we set up Naked. I saw Mr. Turner at, I think, Cineworld in Bradford when it came out. And I remember sitting down and as someone who, you know, hasn't seen, I think we'll make it explicit, we haven't seen all Mike Leigh's films. But we've seen a fair few. But Naked, obviously, is the one that sticks out for us. And that is our most treasured piece. When I saw Mr. Turner, I went into it not reluctantly, but with,
you know, not going in think I was going to see the best thing ever. I mean, for starters, to take on a historical figure, which wasn't the first thing he'd done until Mr. Turner, obviously, but like
seemed sort of contrapuntal to the sort of working class aesthetic that I love him for. And I sat down, and you know what, I do like Mr. Turner, but what I will say is that it doesn't feel like a Mike Leigh film. So it feels like a worthy biopic, and I think Timothy Spall, obviously a Mike Leigh regular, someone that he's worked with before, and he puts in a great performance. I think it's a good film. You know, it doesn't glamorise him at all, and it does all the right things. But at the same time, I'm kind of thinking, this isn't perhaps what I want from Mike Leigh.
And that is exactly how I would characterise my experience with Peterloo. I thought that it was a very decent portrayal of the massacre. Obviously, it's as far as I know, it's the only portrayal. Well, you know, the only film to specifically focus on the massacre.
I think there's been like theatre bits and stuff.
Yeah, but to have that committed to film is in itself a triumph, and I think that's a good thing, and I'm very proud that that exists. But coming back to the idea that Mike Leigh's fingerprints are all over Naked, watching Peterloo, it kind of feels like he was wearing a pair of gloves in a certain sense. His hands were on it, but his fingerprints, I don't know about that. A triumph as a piece of historical depiction of an event.
Also,
And-
someone who's outside of it. I think you're probably going to go into this, but
Outside of it, insofar as, what do you mean, sorry?
so a Mancunian who's lived in London for best part of 60 years or whatever it is.
I think I don't want to get like too hyper personal about it, but Mike Leigh is very much someone who began in the North, and his career has been in London, and it has sort of developed from there, and obviously that's going to change through time. And it very much feels, I mean, I've not seen Mr. Turner, but from what you've been saying, it feels like London has certainly like had its impression upon the way in which he makes films.
The thing that I will say about Mr. Turner is that he still does drive a fucking amazing performance out of his actors. I think that if there's anything, that is the Mike Leigh essence, perhaps.
Yes.
And Timothy Spall does, he puts in a grunting bass, a real performance with it, and you can see that the process has come through. But at the same time, is this the film that Mike Leigh would have made in 1993? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I understand that this is the progression of a filmmaker. He gets to this point, but at the same time, would the Mike Leigh that we love do that?
And it comes back to it. It's, for me, it doesn't feel like working with actors in the same way. It feels more like auteurship in a certain way.
Right, yeah.
Obviously, Peterloo, Maxine Peake is Maxine Peake, i.e. amazing.
Yeah, Maxine Peake, big up.
Absolutely fantastic, and I stand by her through everything that she does and says. Amazing actress.
Yes, we'll say that explicitly. Everything she does, we stand by it.
And to reiterate, everything that she says, we stand by.
Retweets, whatever you want.
Let's not get too political.
No, we won't.
So, it's a great film. It has great performances from its actors, and as a historical piece, it is fantastic, but it is not a Mike Leigh film. And the reason why I dislike Peterloo is precisely because his name is on it. And I went into that with the expectations of having a Mike Leigh, I don't want to say experience, but like having a Mike Leigh film. And I very much was exposed to something which worked, but wasn't in his vein. There were a number of things which I disliked, specifically the idea... Well, let's just get specific, like, the film opens...
This is fresh in your mind, isn't it? I'm a bit hazy with Mr. Turner. I've seen it for years. I've got it.
So the film opens in the Napoleonic Wars, and we have a very, very young bugle player. He has no weapon, no rifle, nothing like that.
I love a bugle player.
He just plays the bugle, and he runs away from the field of combat, and he returns to Manchester. Obviously, the allusion is between Waterloo and Peterloo in Manchester. So he returns from the Napoleonic Wars, and he is essentially... He doesn't know what to do with himself. He's, running away from the army and everything. And he is, for the most part, silent. I would call him an innocent character. And he takes part in a very, very small way in everything which develops with the strike and the demonstration. And, of course, he is the first one to be killed when everything goes wrong. For me, that's not a Mike Leigh development.
No.
It's very, very traditional, but traditional in a non-interesting way.
It's a historical picture. I mean, like when you hear him talking about Naked, he's talking about Hollywood all the time. Like, especially
Definitely.
He's making contrast between what the Hollywood version, what the Hollywood version of Naked would be, and what the Mike Leigh version of Naked would be. And I don't. Yeah, and I think obviously, as we said, I haven't seen Peterloo.
But I don't think you're off the money.
No, but yeah, I think you should carry on for a bit, actually, because I think I'm interjecting too early.
No, I think you're absolutely right insofar as I think you could have watched that film in Los Angeles and it would have had a decent response. I've learned something about, English history.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, it's a war film.
It's in a certain sense, it's just, honestly, it's so caricaturish. That is what I absolutely despise about it. You know, the upper class, it really does feel like caricatures in a way that the yuppie feels like a caricature in Naked. It feels like that's got out of hand a little bit. It feels like Mike Leigh doesn't have experience with the yuppie character. And he doesn't have experience with these Tories, you know, in the early 19th century. It just feels so closeted and cloistered and not characterised. It's almost like it's come from a history textbook.
Yeah.
These are the terrible things that they did, and now we're going to perform the terrible things that they did. There's a scene in the film where, rather early on, where a man is he's been arrested for stealing a coat because he doesn't have a coat. And then the judge sees him and he says, "I'll sentence you to death." "Oh no, I'll send you off to the colony in Australia where you'll live for the rest of your life."
Yeah.
And obviously that happened, things like that. But there is a way of portraying that in cinema which doesn't have to be hyperbolic. It doesn't have to be like, all right, you know, they were really bad, but were they like evil? That's kind of the thing, isn't it? It's like the portrayal of evil has to be something very subtle and something very quotidian and day to day, because that's a very monumental, performative evil, which doesn't exist in real life.
No.
That's something which exists in anecdotal form and in history textbooks. But evil is banal, the banality of evil, right?
Yeah, and we probably
It's
didn't get
everyday.
we didn't get into it enough in Naked, and just kind of the spectre of politics in general in Naked that is so implicit that you completely understand that you'd miss it. You know, whether it be allusions to Thatcher or what you were saying about turning the lights off with Kinnock. And even with the Irish stuff, the Irish subtext, I think if you want to go far enough, we could talk about the IRA.
So I think what's really interesting is that Mike Leigh is very, very outspoken in the fact that he doesn't make British films, he makes European films, and that Naked in itself, although it features London and Manchester, is very much intended to be of a sort of universal European. And when I say European, I mean anti-Hollywood, non-Hollywood. It very much encompasses everything non-North American cinematically. But the fact that the film itself actually contradicts that and actually goes contrary to that, I think is a very, very interesting thing. It runs contrary to this idea of auteurship and the thing which we've been developing so far, insofar as that, like, you're right, even though he says this isn't about 1993, the early 90s, it's not about post-Thatcher, it's not about John Major, it is in a lot of ways, in a way which perhaps a filmmaker can't control when they're seeking this realistic / naturalistic
well, these characters,
aesthetic.
Yeah, these characters aren't going to go about thinking about that. You know, you're not going to get Ewan Bremner all of a sudden going on a polemic about I don't know, his background and the political situation. No, he's going to be shouting Maggie. That's what he's going to be doing.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's part of what I was saying earlier. With class is something you don't think about. The same is true of politics.
Yeah.
And your historical situation is unconscious. And it doesn't always need to be overtly exclaimed in the same way.
Well,
as
people
Maggie.
don't do that. Unless, they've had a few.
Of course, yeah. But it exists, and it's palpable, and it's there.
It is there. So, I mean, I suppose Peterloo is his way of getting rid of all that excess and dealing with the historical. I mean, I suppose, I don't know whether this comes with being a veteran filmmaker, someone who's got the fellowship or whatever, deciding that you're going to tackle you're going to do the historical epic, but do it on your own terms. I suppose Peterloo is his way of, I don't know, that's his statement in terms of history, in the same way that Spielberg made The Crisis That Be Schindler's List.
Yes. So what I would...
Why discussion?
Yeah, that's one for another. We'll put a pin in that and return to that in a later episode. But what I would sort of say is that the reason why it's disappointing is the fact that, as I raised earlier, is that Mike Leigh is someone who asks questions. He's not one who gives answers. Mm-hmm. And that's a film that gives a lot of answers. And in my opinion, there weren't a whole lot of questions which preceded that. You leave Naked not knowing what to do with yourself. Not knowing what to do with that film, and also not knowing what to do with yourself. It's a very, very it's a film that you carry with you in a way that you cannot carry Peterly with you, because it says what it says, and once it's finished saying that, you just go about your life. And that's something that, like, Naked will never be, and lots of other Mike Leigh films will never be.
No, they won't. And I mean, I think this is just a general rubric by which to grade films, and it's whether it inspires discussion alone. You know what I mean? Like, Naked has inspired this conversation, and all the films that we talk about subsequent are going to be, well, we won't talk about them otherwise, but they're going to inspire serious, deep discussion. And, you know, even I think perhaps a more gentle approach towards Mike Leigh now is that he is someone that has made Naked, and I don't expect him to make Naked again, nor do you. You know what I mean? But I think it's an interesting thing to chart the trajectory of a filmmaker in that way, and kind of view it by, sort of judge it on the terms by which the most visceral and alive and stuff. You know, I mean, how old? I don't know how old Mike Leigh was at the time that he made Naked. He's got to be
old.
I mean, he's always looked old. No offense, Mike, but you've always you've never looked young.
Was he born in the 40s or
mid-40s? I mean, he always talks about 50s being.
He does talk about
year.
the 1950s. He's born in 1943. So the fact that Naked was made in 1993.
Do the maths, because I can't do it.
50.
Wow.
Yeah. 50.
So
that's post midlife crisis period.
So as two 23-year-olds, and please hold us account to this if anything ever changes, but like, as a 50-year-old, if you were to make Naked, I mean, with all the nuance, with all, you know, all the stuff that we've been talking about up to this point, how do you, I mean, since then he's sort of made a slew of films about elderly people, and we're just looking at a picture of him now. I mean, yeah, he wears it on his face. He's obviously someone who has been through it. He understands it. But I find it interesting that a 50-year-old can make a film like Naked.
I agree. And working with such young actors as well. Obviously, Thewlis was 27 when he made that film, as Johnny is 27 himself.
27. Well, there's that bit where
Maggie.
With Maggie, where they go to get some food, and Toby Jones is there actually. A little bit of bit of a side note. Toby Jones, who's made some. In fact, I'll go off on one.
Let's focus.
Yep. You've had like basically the cream of the fucking crop in terms of young British talent, and to harvest that and completely understand that, I commend. I mean, name another 50-year-old that can completely encapsulate that sort of thing, and the majority of people, the majority of auteurs or filmmakers that make films like Naked, they're the same age as the protagonists. You know what I mean? They're definitely a part of that. And there are obviously parallels between him and Johnny that he's talked about before. But like, that's an interesting one. So how old is he now?
Well, obviously 43. So,
I mean, I can't work it out.
I'm not sure off the top of my head.
He's old anyway.
He is, yeah. But I suppose
we won't digress on age.
Yeah,
that's probably.
It's probably
as two 23-year-olds, it seems a bit fucking.
He's 77 now.
Right, he's 77. I mean, God, he's got to feel good.
He's doing well.
He's got to feel
He's doing well, and I wish him all the best for the future. And I hope that this historical trend in his films reaches a natural conclusion.
He needs to do a real meditation on age, doesn't he?
I mean, it's the right time for it. It certainly is.
He'll do a good pandemic film, surely.
Anyway, I think that we have reached a natural conclusion with our discussion of Naked, and it's been a pleasure to talk about it.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I mean, we were talking about it before.
I mean, it's a film that we've been in dialogue with about this film probably for the last 10 years.
Yeah, and we've not touched upon a lot of stuff that
we've missed a lot of points that we wanted to talk about, but we don't want to drag this out to something which is unbearably long. So I think that now it's probably a time to sort of say, you know, thank you very much for joining us on this journey. I hope that you watch this film. I hope that you engage with this film. I hope you engage with Mike Leigh in general. But specifically with this film, I would be very, very interested. I think we'd both be very, very interested to know, you know, what you think about Thewlis and what you think specifically about some of the things, the dialogue, the language, and the way in which this film is shot, and any sort of thoughts. We're very, very open to feedback and everything. Any questions, any statements. I mean, at this point, we will respond to absolutely anything.
Absolutely anything.
But, you know, we're one of those people, you know, we are those people who love film. We love this thing, and, like, anything you've got to say, any engagement with it,
please.
Let's have it.
Please. Because otherwise it's just me and Ben for ages.
That's what I was going to say. We've existed for a very, very long time where we're the only people, you know, to have an in-depth conversation about films like this, and to find any like-minded individuals is something which I'm excited about. And I'm excited about. Yeah.
So you should. I mean, we've got plenty in the can that we're going to unveil. Don't you worry. It's not all going to be British kitchen sink. It's going to go
full magazine.
Yeah, it's going to be full magazine. So you can expect things all over the shop.
Absolutely. Stay tuned, and we will get back to you in the very, very near future. Thank you very much for listening, and we will speak to you next time.